Well, hello, Simon. How are you doing this week?
Hello, AA. In the kayfabe of streaming, just for the benefit of the audience, we have actually been chatting and saying hello before we've actually said hello performatively, just as we've done right now. And that's because television is propaganda. And that's a direct quote from Adam Curtis.
Right. Okay. Well, shall we do some things that we didn't do? Like, for example, most normal people would say, oh, Simon, how was your Christmas? Happy New Year, by the way.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Shall we do all of that sort of stuff?
I had a terrible Christmas, AA. I had the flu and I was literally in bed for a week. And I felt wretched, but I had a quiet time, and I had Hector Drummond over, and we watched. I showed him The Long Good Friday, which he'd never seen before, and the M.R. James Christmas stories, Whistle and I'll Come to You, and a Warning to the Curious, both made in the sort of late 60s, early 70s, very atmospheric Christmas horror films, and that was very enjoyable. And mostly, I just rejected the company of people.
Oh, excellent. All right. So,
how about you?
I like the idea of you having Hector Drummond over and watching a couple of horror movies together.
Oh, he's unbearable.
Maybe a spot of the old NES, you know.
Yeah.
Super Mario Brothers together, you know, it's kind of romantic. But
yeah, we just drank wine and complained.
My mother was ill, and similarly, I think there's something going around, isn't there?
Several flus actually. Apparently, there's about 4 different bugs going around. I read.
And it didn't clear for a very long time, and I'm convinced that it was the same one that I had much earlier in the year. Because do you remember I had a cold that just wouldn't clear for felt like 5-6 weeks.
Horrible.
And but so that but I wasn't actually back for long because I stupidly booked a dishwasher, a new dishwasher to come on the Friday, so we had to come back early. And then it was a case of thankfully AAA's gone back to school now, but it was a case of like keeping her occupied. But I have mainly been writing my Shakespeare course because I said, I mean, do you remember, if you remember before Christmas, I was starting to get het up. I was saying, right, come January, everybody can bugger off because I'm I have to do my work. Well, I finally got my time to be at the lodge and do nothing but work on the course. And I've been slowly, you know, in The Shining. When he's slowly going up the wall, you know.
You were doing the look, weren't you? The Kubrick stare.
I've had some times where, you know, it's 4:30 in the morning, and I've spent literally 3 hours trying to figure out what 2 bloody lines in King Lear mean, which I told you about, didn't I?
All foundations of Shakespeare and no play makes AA a dull boy.
So it's also a bit weird because it's like going back through the debris of my life and splicing together this course where it's like, oh, you know, I remember that talk I gave at the British Museum, and I remember where I was when I put that one together. Do I still think that now? Does it matter? It's 4 a.m. Hold on. Have I contradicted myself there on page 12, what I say on page 82? I don't care anymore.
Best not to look back. No, it's all done. I was charmed actually to listen to your Ladybird reading of Cinderella yesterday, and
thanks.
Yeah, very nice, very nice. I thought good move, good tactical move, because with you, it's always the timing. It's you're probably thinking, well, the Wiggles are probably all on their second divorces now, and they've probably got morphine addictions, and that act is running down. So I'm going to get in there with the children's entertainment market. It's a good dollar to chase, good dollar.
Well, I mean, I bought that collection of Ladybird books, of which Cinderella is number one.
Yeah.
And with my Curry millions, remember I got the Curry payout.
Yeah.
I bought a webcam and one of those overhead. Well, it's actually a mic boom.
Oh yeah.
Right, and then I got a special mic boom to webcam converter widget. If you want to get very technical, it's like a little nut that you put on the end of the mic boom, and it turns into a webcam hole. You can basically screw the webcam on there. So it's now like an overhead. It's like an overhead projector.
Oh,
I wanted one of those. I mean, speaking of lecturing, if you remember in the lecture halls, they had those overheads, those old-fashioned overhead things that you could put paper under. Right?
Yeah, it's all plastic that you sort of that's it.
Well, I've wanted one of those for the channel for a long time, and on Monday I finally get to show it off with my 3-volume selected works of Lenin.
Fantastic.
Because my bid to alienate the libertarians is working, Simon. I'm starting to get large essays. I've had a 3-part, 3-hour response essay from a Polish libertarian on my apparent Marxist.
Whoa. Well, I have to say, I was thinking I made a mistake that we were going to be doing all Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace this week, but you correctly made us work through the vegetables towards the delights of the plate first. We do the short films in the order, but I am reminded. I looked at the first episode of All Watched Over again the other night, and as the young people today say, given recent events with the tech bros, it goes hard. I will say that.
Oh right, yes. How exciting! How exciting, yeah. That Musk does not make an appearance, I take it.
He doesn't. Larry Ellison does in a short clip at the beginning, and a few other people who most will never have heard of in Silicon Valley. But certainly the sort of careless Randian libertarianism, meshed with what then happened with the Asian debt crisis. Actually, I just watched it, and towards the end, it sort of blew my mind again. Actually, as to what trouble we're in.
Yeah, that's going to be
China owning most of US debt. Yeah.
Well, this is just a kind of what do they call it? Little starter. What's that little starter that you get? Even
an amuse-bouche.
An amuse-bouche. The little, the gay little entree that they give you.
Yes, the chef has prepared this just for you. He thought you'd like it, and they give that little personalized announcement to make you think you're special.
Yes, and it's like one tiny little blinny thing with a tiny bit of caviar or something. So,
and I always have an Alan Partridge moment where I say, "Am I being charged for this?"
Anyway, that camera arm that I've made, I thought I'd put it to use by slowly but surely reading through those Ladybird books.
Yes,
because I could potentially, if I can't be bothered to read, I could potentially use them. But also something to do with the AA Mellow channel, which is lying fallow. And as I discovered, YouTube actually punish you if a channel doesn't do anything for 6 months, I think it is. Wow. It's like, oh, you're no longer a partner because you haven't been uploading. So I need something to put on 2 little side channels.
What about your plaque? You haven't had your plaque yet, have you? Or
no, I haven't. Apparently, you have to send off for it, and I'm like,
no.
Ceremony means nothing to me. I don't want it.
Our idle ceremony. Yes.
Do you know I never went to my PhD graduation ceremony?
Based. Chuck it back in their faces. I never went to my degree either.
Come on. Off to the next challenge, off to the next fight, like Ryu, the World Warrior. That's what I say. Yeah. I don't need.
No.
I always think of Slim in Of Mice and Men, which the kids now won't have read because it's been banned for woke reasons, I believe.
Yes.
But do you remember there was a cowboy in Of Mice and Men who didn't have the the spokes on his, like they had
Spurs.
the spurs on his heels.
Mm.
He didn't need them. Whereas the rancher's son or whatever, Curly, he had all the bells and whistles, right? And I don't need. I want to be like Slim. So I don't want them. I don't even know if I've got my PhD degree. Like if I ever collected it, if I ever have the piece of paper, it's probably in a drawer in my parents' house, as all my degrees are. I don't have
on embossed vellum with a huge wax seal on it, hanging down.
I don't know. I don't know. I'm not sure if I've ever even looked at it. Yeah. I mean, I have one. But... yeah. So anyway, I've always been like that. I'm also against, as you know, Simon, celebrating things that everybody has to do, like graduating school. They do that in America. Oh, well done. You've got through something that the state forces you to go through. Yes. Oh, brilliant. Well done, Johnny.
Participation certificate.
Fuck.
Yeah.
Or more controversially, passing your driving test.
Mere frippery and baubles. Who needs them?
Come on.
I just don't even bother with having a license.
You've got 3 things: driving, riding a bike, swimming. Right, those 3 things.
Achievement certificates.
You may get a special pass if you live in London, because you've got like a cool reason to not be able to drive if you live in London. But other than that, those 3 things come as standard. It's almost like just like a kind of, once upon a time they had rites of passage that you had to go through. Like and to me, it's just like you can't really get your adult badge until you can do those 3 things.
No.
Although I'm not the best swimmer in the world, I have to say. I can swim, but I don't. It's not my, I don't take to it like a fish.
You get into a sort of lovely meditative trance state. You can just sort of weirdly keep going. I like it. I mean, I'm not particularly a fan of it, but when I do it, it's very relaxing, very soothing.
Well, my issue is, Simon, I never mastered the breaststroke. And that's the one, isn't it? That's the cruise gear that the oldies can go forever and ever.
Oh no, I don't like the breaststroke. No, I don't do it. I just do overarm.
Oh right.
Well, and I just sort of get into a cycle of just going up and down the pool. I used to live near an Olympic-sized pool, and it was great.
Oh wow.
And just sort of go into a zone, and I'd realize I'd be there for ages. But you do feel like lead afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, he's talking about the front crawl, what do they call it? The overarm, it's the sprint gear, isn't it? That one. I can do that one.
Yeah.
Overarm,
yeah.
I can do overarm, I can do back, the backstroke.
But breaststroke is for pansies, basically, isn't it, really?
I never mastered the breaststroke, and I also have never done the butterfly.
No, it's a ridiculous stroke.
Whereas the missus, she was like she competed in swimming when she was a teenager and things. So she's actually a very, very good swimmer. So depends on what you measure yourself against. Anyway, enough of the pre-show waffle. Admittedly, we were paddling, Simon. We were keeping water, or whatever they call it.
Treading water.
Treading water to allow enough people to trickle in for us to start. As Simon mentioned, we are going to be covering the Charlie Brooker shorts, which is going to be starting with the rise and fall of the television journalist. Now, let's just talk about Charlie Brooker for a moment, Simon. I had completely forgotten that Charlie Brooker existed until I remembered that we were going to be covering these, and I hadn't seen him for a long time. I mean, do you want to say something about Charlie Brooker?
This all feels like a very long time ago now, doesn't it? Charlie Brooker doing his screen wipe sort of TV review shows, and this actually is interesting because it does represent a pivot point in Curtis's career. We've gone through the early phase Curtis, Pandora's Box, Living Dead, all that stuff you did solo. And then we went on to what I call the sort of classic golden period Curtis, from the Mayfair set up to the Trap. And this is a sort of pivot point where he starts to try and formulate, which we'll talk about later, this idea of his emotional journalism. And All Watched Over is the kind of attempt he makes to, as he says, sort of marry emotional stories to sort of hard-edged political issues. And I'm not sure if they're wholly successful. It's an odd series, All Watched Over, but actually it does have some powerful themes in it. And it's him pivoting towards this form where he becomes much more experimental because of the iPlayer, in doing things like Bitter Lake and Hypernormalization, these massive, long, sprawling films, which have a much more sort of, immersive and textured feel. And the music becomes even more significant with those sorts of films. Less narration, a few of the sort of text cards on screen. But anyway, Charlie Brooker kind of aligns with this somewhat, because he comes out. I mean, I first encountered him, not that I necessarily knew who he was. Back in 1999, I was working in an office in London, and a friend said, "Hey, look at this website." And it was a website called TV Go Home. I don't know if you ever saw it. It was essentially a parody of the Radio Times listings. And it was, the man behind it was Charlie Brooker, and it was exceptionally funny. It was really, really funny. It was all of these kind of improbable programs in a TV listings section. I mean, I can't really mention many of them on air because they're quite sweary, but they are funny. So if you look up TV Go Home and look for some screenshots of some of the things that he used to write, I mean, one of the favorite fictitious programs that he came up with was Vin Diesel's favorite 500 tartans. Vin Diesel goes on a road trip of Scotland to pick out his favorite tartans. They're just ridiculous conceits. And Charlie Brooker becomes someone who is expressing an interest in his work in communications technology, the internet, and news and perception. And he has this program, Screen Wipe, about 10, 15 years later, where he breaks down news events, through a satiric gaze, but also a certain reflexivity about his own standpoint on events. And eventually he invites Curtis in to do a few of these short films from 2007 onwards. And these are very, very short Curtis pieces, 5-6 minutes long. And some of them I think are not wholly meant to be taken seriously, especially I think the one on Richard Nixon is a bit glib. But But Brooker, his kind of framing as well, when he sort of introduces the films, there's interesting little bits in there. So it's not just the films themselves; it's the way he anticipates what Curtis is doing, and he makes his own kind of little contributory visual and stylistic jokes to them as well. And I think they're sort of very much of a mind in terms of exploring this theme, as I said, of television as propaganda, and very self-consciously so. I've been looking at a few different talks that Curtis gave, because this is the time around between 2007 2011 where he starts to come out of the woodwork. A bit like Brooker as well, because I mean Brooker was the kind of unknown author of the TV Go Home website for a long time, and then eventually he was revealed. And Curtis was a mystery man as well for a very long time. And it was about this time he started to give interviews and to give talks. And I found there was a few talks that he gave, which I'll post links to later, at various sort of art festivals and documentary festivals. And he did this one at Sheffield in 2011. And there was a very interesting moment where he was talking with a head of a BBC head of channel who he used to work with. And he came out with this saying, he said, "Look, television is propaganda." And the interesting reaction was the audience, they all applauded. They were all saying, "Oh, how brave of him to say that." And he said, no, don't applaud. It's just a fact, right? He was sort of elucidating the point that, we feel, he says, plugged in to the world because of this massive media culture backdrop, what he calls the scenery. And he says, but it's highly constructed, and that's just a fact. He says, in a practical sense, how do you know any of it is true? How do you, quote, break the scenery? And he says, what I try to do is to reconstruct the scenery. And he says, it's not a postmodern exercise. I'm not interested in that. But I am just trying to attempt to find, a restabilized meaning when you're, as we're going to see in these documentaries, in a time where everything has been stripped of meaning. Everything is, to use Debord's concept, the spectacle. and we're sort of the passive consumers of that. So it's an interesting mesh at this point where Curtis is sort of trying to say, what is my method? I want to show you and expose that method, and it's a little bit Brechtian. He's pointing to, look, I'm doing this now. He makes his edits they're very obvious, they're very conscious, they're jumpy, and he explicitly says, I'm trying to show you that I'm constructing this stuff. I'm not sort of saying this is the only truth. This is a counter myth, if you like, to what you're seeing from the mainstream, which just kind of pours it all over you, and then you either have to just sort of deal with it, or reject it and go down possibly things like a conspiracy worldview, which he deals with later, and we'll talk about that.
Yeah. Just before we get going on these, on Charlie Brooker, I was really jolted by the fact that, I mean, because Brooker, again, I'm a fan of Stuart Lee, right? I would say Charlie Brooker is somewhat in that same ballpark of
yes,
super smug left-wingers who live in a kind of smug bubble, I guess you put it that way.
Yeah.
But there's something about like that worldview, the worldview that we see on the Newswipe or Brooker Wipe, whatever that show that he used to do, of which I used to watch. I feel like it's come on, like, has it survived the culture wars? Has does this space of the Charlie Brooker smug show still exist, or has it just been completely decimated because they can't do their kind of arch ambivalent act anymore?
Yeah, it's like it's fallen out of fashion, hasn't it? Because as the culture wars have gone on, that kind of reflexive criticality is actually perhaps, I think, sensed by institutions as a weakness in some way. It's like, I think you've talked about it recently about with the left, there shouldn't be any dialogue. There should be you setting the frame. And I think they feel perhaps under such attack, especially at places like the BBC. I mean, again, they're not all powerful, but I think they are aware that they're hated as well, and I think they've got into this mode of actually not even entering the field of that kind of distance discussion of what are we doing with the news. I think all of that stuff, in a sense, is a relic of a more interesting age where they were prepared to play with things like that. I mean, it's interesting that Adam Curtis now more or less has his stuff straight onto the iPlayer rather than onto the television, so that it can be consumed personally and individualistically rather than as broadcast, because to be frank, it's probably a bit too much for the bewildered herd from the point of view of the BBC now. So I think they have retreated, and I don't think they'll feel secure doing that stuff anymore. I mean, I'll be interested to see if Stuart Lee has another show on the BBC.
I also feel like it to engage in the culture wars, or into the the trite kind of woke versus anti-woke frame, for someone like Brooker or indeed Stuart Lee, it kind of hurts their cool, doesn't it? Because it's I mean, I always felt, but even back in the day, that overtly talking about things like racism and sexism and so on was kind of already tired and trite by our. So there was always an irony around it, in the same way that Ricky Gervais played with it, where it was just like, it was kind of obvious. We've heard this a million times. So there was a strange distancing that happened in that whole generation of people, which I would put Brooker in there with that. If he came out with like a woke diatribe, he'd hurt his brand, wouldn't he? Let's face it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of them are sort of hunkering down. I mean, I know I worked with, I did a film shoot with some reasonably well-known comedy actors who appear a lot on the BBC recently, and it seems they all kind of live in a more or less sort of closed bubble in places like Stoke Newington, and they all kind of see each other and hang out, but they're sort of not being very adventurous in terms of this sort of work anymore. And I think also I was chatting to one of them, and he said, because he did a show on the BBC, he had his own show for a while. I won't name who it is, but he had his own show, and it was one of those kind of a bit like, have you ever seen the Peter Serafinovich show? He had a sort of, he does his impressions and his little skits and so on. And I enjoyed those kinds of things. They were quite humorous. They were sort of knowing, but again, these people, they will tend to be not on our side. But I was talking to this chap and he said when he did his show, which I think was about 10, 12 years ago now, the BBC said to him, this is probably going to be the last show like this, where we have someone come on, if you like, and give their kind of, comedy vision. And since then it's kind of died, where they've tried to just resurrect a comedy stream through committee and through these awful kinds of show. I mean, there was some show about sort of lesbian hairdressers or some such rubbish that sort of died a little while back, and the sort of if you like, the authorial voice is, I think, treated much more warily in favor of you see things on the BBC that do well now. There are things like The Detectorists, that show with Toby Jones and Mackenzie Crook. It's kind of heartwarming, sort of local stories kind of stuff. It's narratives. I mean, Gavin and Stacey, came back at Christmas.
I noticed that. Yeah,
big hurrah. So it's that kind of down home with the family. Oh, everybody likes Uncle Bryn. I mean, I've never seen the show, but I know of it by this advanced reputation. But it's this kind of coziness that has been actually cultivated over decades now, and it's a bit like having the Frank Sinatra farewell tours, that go on endlessly.
Yeah.
Just revive that old cozy stuff.
I happened to watch the Paddington movies over Christmas.
Yeah.
I one of my friends said that Paddington 2 is one of the top 5 films of all time. Because they were disappointed by Paddington in Peru. So I over Christmas I ended up watching Paddington 2 and then taking AAA to watch Paddington in Peru, right? Wow. So I could have an informed opinion and get back to my mate. Now I will admit Paddington 2 is a brilliant film, for what it's doing.
Yeah.
But that coziness that you're talking about is very deeply embedded in those Paddington films. Yeah. This is like a kind of, it's almost like a kind of not Adam Curtis, but Richard Curtis.
I was going to say it's a post Richard Curtis world, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. Where even the prison in Paddington 2 is kind of quaint,
Yeah, absolutely. There is something. I mean, funnily enough, I felt a pang of that at Christmas when I had Hector over. I said, let's watch a film. And we just argued for several hours about what film to watch. And I settled on a film with Hugh Grant. He did a horror film recently called Heretic. I mean, it's terrible. It's terrible. But what I was feeling in need of, the dirty admission I had to make to myself, I want something with a bit of cozy Hugh Grant, because you've got that linkage to that memory of that time in the 90s where, it wasn't even necessarily that you liked Hugh Grant or liked Notting Hill or Love Actually. You just were going back to that time. His reassuring floppy head, public schoolness sort of took you there.
He is quite good in Paddington 2. It may be his career performance, if you've never seen
that. Yeah. He's actually a very good actor. Did you ever see A Very English Scandal where he played Jeremy Thorpe?
Yeah, he was good. I liked him in About a Boy, which is a film that nobody really talks about, but I kind of like it where he leans into his more villainous side.
Oh yeah, he's actually, like most actors, they're just get a disservice by terrible directing or terrible scripts, and actually if you give them something that they can get their teeth into, they'll do a good job of work for you.
Someone's saying grow up. I mean, what? Hugh Grant is really good in Paddington 2. I'm not. Anyway, Simon, before we get on, finally, I did find an article from a previous age, right? A long forgotten and bygone era, which may be of interest because it's an article by a certain Brendan O'Neill, the chief political writer of Spite. Date 29th of January 2010. Right. So this is pre-culture wars, pre-modern era, pre-Trump, old-fashioned Spite back from 2010.
Yeah.
Would you like would you like me to read a little bit of this? Because the subject of the article is Charlie Brooker. The attack dog of mainstream misanthropy. I don't know what's Brendan O'Neill is kind of yobbish, isn't he? Can I do like a yobbish?
I think he tries to be a peacemaker. I mean, I've met Brendan O'Neill actually. I met him years ago at a podcast live thing, and me and a friend went to the pub with him, and he was a nice chap. I had to admit, he was all right. You know, we shared a love of Michael Nyman music, apparently, which is good. But I did say to him at the time, I said, we're in this interesting moment where left and right are sort of, you know, playing footsie a bit. I said, what will it be like in a few years' time when this collegiate spirit disappears and we all hate each other again? And he just kind of laughed.
But anyway, he said, with his hatred of nightclubs and blokes, his constant carping on about what's on TV, and his recent campaign to censure a newspaper columnist, Charlie Brooker is the closest thing we have to a modern day Mary Whitehouse.
WTF? I love Charlie Brooker now.
So this is basically having a go at Charlie Brooker's Guardian column, where Charlie Brooker swears. So he's having a go at that. But he says a reoccurring conceit in Charlie Brooker's column in the Guardian is that Brooker is a prick and an absolute shit who writes gibberish. His words, but I won't quibble, doesn't really belong in such an apparently respectable organ. I'm amazed I get it published in a newspaper, he said recently in an interview. He takes this teenage complaint of I'm really crap, everyone thinks I'm brilliant. How fucked up is that? And next step further in his published collection of columns titled The Hell of It All, next to the logo of Faber and Faber, one of the poshest and most esteemed publishing houses in Britain, there is Brooker again, describing himself as a hideous, cueless celebrity failure. Something doesn't quite add up, does it, reader? Brooker's conceit is actually quite clever, very clever. Probably the cleverest thing in his weekly outpourings, the vast majority of which I feel like having a conversation with a 15-year-old boy suffering from adjectivitis, who imagines he is the first person in history to hate the modern world and everyone who inhabits it, when in fact everyone from William Blake to Joseph Goebbels to Mary Whitehouse got their yonks before him. Because in presenting himself as a gatecrasher in the world of liberal letters, a grumpy outsider who talks bollocks but keeps on getting published for some inexplicable reason, Brooker can express what for him is clearly an unpalatable truth, that he is fated in The Guardian and by Faber and Faber and on BBC4 because his views, far from being fucking weird, shine perfectly with the stony-faced miserablism that passes for being a liberal these days. Brooker has perfected his act as obtuse, overgrown teenager to disguise what he really is, the attacked dog of mainstream misanthropy. So what this article is doing for me, Simon, is explaining to me why I kind of like Charlie Brooker.
Yeah.
But I mean, I'm a misanthropist and miserable. So.
Well, it's where it intersects, isn't it, with this sort of I've always, I've got this theory about the left, having this submerged sense of reaction. They're kind of, it comes out of that stuff I talked about, episodes back, about the sort of hauntological, about they're in love with a certain vision of the post-war world in Britain, the sort of the post-war consensus, the liberal welfare state, and the sort of creativity that was unleashed under that. And they now adopt this thing which you hear expressed on places like Twitter. People use the words like cockwomble for the sort of centrist dad brigade who puts in his Twitter bio a bit sweary, and they kind of like to think that sort of signals them as, being no man's fool. They're a bit of edge and they'll tell it like it is. But in that liberal context, not the Mike Graham tell it like it is, sort of shtick. But this is the mode of signaling that, you have an attractive curmudgeonliness that can, sort of critique all the mad things going on in the world, and of course it'll be inflected towards one particular side. We know he's not gonna come out and sort of advocate for Donald Trump or anything like that. And it's a cozy niche. It's a cozy niche.
It's a shame, Simon, because by rights these should be like my people. These should be like our people. Why don't they take the natural conclusion? I mean, this actually exists all the way back in the era of Marx, right?
Yeah.
You can take passages of Carlyle, the original grumpy curmudgeon, right? Yeah. And you can take passages of Carlyle fondly looking back at the medieval era and wondering why the modern Victorian world around him is so shit, right?
Yeah.
Marx has got exactly the same passages in Communist Manifesto. In like there's a communist kind of neo-Carlylean reaction in there, which has long been pointed out. Like Marxists are aware of this, that they kind of they feel an affinity to the old medieval peasant, and possibly even to the old medieval order in general, because they you know, in their weaker moments, when they're not kind of being polemical and so on, they recognize the noblesse oblige of the old ruling aristocracy that is completely absent in the bourgeois, in the capitalist class, right? So and in a way, if you follow them to their kind of positing, like, well, we should be in charge, and when we have the dictatorship of the proletariat, we're essentially going to be in the place of the old aristocrats. So you know, there is this there's this strange crossover there, but it exists here in Brooker as well. But anyway, if we carry on going down here, let's get to the bit where he talks about Mary Whitehouse. See if we can find it here.
It is. I will say it's also irritating when Brooker comes off with the sweary centrist dad stuff, because it's such an easy deflection for many, let's say, trickier issues in terms of addressing certain realities, as we're doing right now.
It is, yeah. And I would say that I mean, I don't know, some of those Black Mirror episodes go to interesting places as well, I'd suggest. But the best we can say about Brooker, I think, is that he's a conflicted individual.
Yes.
That it sometimes stumbles on little things. But let's have a look at this bit. Indeed, in many ways, Brooker is the Mary Whitehouse of our age. Like her, he is alarmed by the garish antics of young people. Like her, he is shocked by what happens in nightclubs. And like her, he has made a career from moaning about what is on the box. Whitehouse was a constant campaigner against smut on TV, while Brooker, in a modern twist on that conservative, purple-haired approach to shocking content, makes a living from writing about the dross they show on TV and presenting a TV show that ridicules it. Of course, the only difference between Whitehouse and Brooker is that he doesn't want to censor smut. So there we go. I mean, there is something to that critique by Brendan O'Neill, and it's also recognizable in Stuart Lee as well, I think. But anyway, shall we make a start? Let's this is the first one, The Rise and Fall of the Journalist, from 2007.
Now here's a short film from Adam Curtis, the man behind The Century of the Self, The Power of Nightmares and The Trap. Well, we seem to have lost the...
Pause. Just want to drive people mad straight away there. So, I mean, he's doing an interesting thing there that... I've just just lost my notes there. He's I mean, Adam Curtis, he talks about, he says why Brooker is brilliant. He says he doesn't just report on things, he reports on his reaction to things. He observes himself and his feelings. And Curtis's point is he thinks this connects with other people rather than what the media tend to do, which is just sort of declare the state of affairs and leave people to kind of process it. But it's what he's doing here is an interesting little sort of, it's like a Curtis joke in a way. He's making a sort of dig at that kind of liminal footage that Curtis likes to use. The sort of footage where Curtis has got a newsreader who's waiting for, someone to come on the line, or a politician who's being interviewed and they're picking their nose or something like that. It's all the stuff that happens before the thing is said. It's the kind of the discarded footage which Curtis loves. I mean, Curtis has an admitted love of what he'll just talk about junk and the internet being full of sort of junk culture, and these kind of throwaway moments he finds actually are more interesting and telling. And that's a moment where you see the construction of news. It doesn't go to plan. We've all seen sort of live broadcasts where the journalist is kind of looking down at the monitor and saying, where's that footage? That'll be coming up in a few minutes. Well, we seem to have lost that. Let's move on. It's the unplanned nature of that storytelling construction machine when it breaks and when it fails. And that's where Curtis thinks the interest is, in looking at the raw footage. And he'll talk a little bit about that later anyway.
Yeah, now this guy on the screen here is Sir Robin Day. Is that right, Simon?
That is Robin Day. Yeah. Now,
this figure is interesting to me because he was before my time, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I was born in the early 80s.
Yeah.
And he was already not on TV anymore. Okay.
Yeah.
But yet he was in all the clips, right?
Yeah.
So Robin Day is a person who exists for me solely in clips.
Yes.
And his reputation is massive, both in those clips and in my mind.
Yeah.
And yet I never experienced him because I wasn't alive. This is a weird thing, right?
And well, this is a lot of, again, Curtis's theme going back to the hauntological. It's people having feeling the pull of a past that they might not have experienced themselves, but they kind of have these markers that sort of drag them back. And Robin Day is kind of an avatar of, the classic BBC with his big glasses and his natty bow ties, and a sort of, a more civilized age of, interviewing, when you had people like him, I suppose, and Brian Walden as well was another one, where it was before the style of the attack dog interview, exemplified by people like Jeremy Paxman and later Andrew Neil, and this sort of aggressive, if you like, market-driven BBC. This was much more the kind of charming, slightly ponderous BBC. In a way, the tail end of the stuff we saw when we saw the clips of Isaiah Berlin and J.B. Priestley on that program from 1964, that sort of, port and cigars BBC.
Or Macmillan being interviewed, Prime Minister, what would you like to tell us today? Oh, well.
You had a moment like that with your Jess Gill interview recently. Essentially, laying out. And is there anything else you'd like to tell us, academic agent? Which is nice. It's nice to see a return to that kind of fawning style.
Well, to be honest, one interviewer who does give interviews like that occasionally is Tucker Carlson.
Yeah.
Tucker Carlson has got that mode, and he was criticized for it roundly when he interviewed Vladimir Putin in that manner.
Yeah.
Mr. President, Mr. Putin, anything you'd like to tell us? Yes, 45 minutes of Russian history. Do you remember that?
Yeah, well, to be honest, I'm not really opposed to that indulgence, because I'm kind of sick of the kind of gotcha approach. It doesn't really elucidate anything for me. I would rather listen to conversations with people, because the cleverer interviews, particularly by people like Brian Walden, I think, used to capture people in moments of unguardedness during conversations, rather than line them up in the sites explicitly and signal to them that this was a hostile interview. I kind of sort of don't see the point of that.
I always remember a ContraPoints video.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember ContraPoints?
I didn't. This is something before my time in the sort of dim, distant internet Gamergate age, isn't it?
Well, ContraPoints was was a left wing, quote unquote, SJW YouTuber. Right. Who started out as a man dressing up as a woman, and then became a woman in their parlance, right?
Yeah. Okay.
I think. Yeah. Well, ContraPoints used to dress up a lot, and I remember she was criticizing I don't bloody know, they were criticizing Dave Rubin, right?
Yeah.
And it was like, Dave Rubin sitting there, and then, she dressed up as a full Nazi with the boots, the helmet, kind of like, doing the salute,
Wow.
And Dave Rubin just sitting there nodding and kind of, and her point was like, well, this interview style where you never push back.
Yes,
it's like, well, you're literally just letting a Nazi talk. That was their point.
Oh, and what an own. Oh.
And I don't know. It's kind of it must have been effective because it stuck with me all these years later.
Yeah. That's interesting.
ContraPoints. You got underneath the mind, as Bowden would say.
Yeah. I'd like to
with
look
that
at that
one. And I've always thought that from the point of view of power, that actually ContraPoints is probably right. From the left-wing point of view, you just want to ban Dave Rubin from doing that.
Yes. But then we don't believe in free speech in the same way, do we? Right and left, or at least maybe we do.
I mean, just from a value-free power perspective, Douglas Murray's always got this line, the myth is, sunlight is the best disinfectant. All you need to do is show these people in the light of day, and inevitably the absurdity of their arguments will crumble into dust. Well, that's the kind of liberal idea.
Yes.
That is not true, right?
Yes.
In my experience, whenever the debate takes place, the liberals' mind gets melted and they turn into a gibbering wreck.
Yeah.
And the stage managed Nick Griffin moment that they imagine on the BBC. Remember, that was stage managed gotcha nonsense, right?
Yeah.
Where they'd handpick the audience and they'd handpick the attack dog responses, etc. In the real world and on the internet, that is not what has happened.
No.
What has happened is the hard right position has just won out. It's smashed the centrist liberal one into dust. And what interests me going forward is that I believe that in the Donald Trump era, in the Elon Musk Brave New World, that dynamic is not going to go away, right? And the centrist, the liberal, is going to be confronted with the fact that actually maybe the left were right about this free speech thing, because we're getting our asses kicked here. Yeah. Isn't that right, James Lindsay? Right? Isn't that right? I mean, James Lindsay, like, at what point is he just going to outright become the SJW calling for the bannings? I think he will. I think that's where it will always go, and that's where the SJWs ended up being in their position. So, in a strange way, as ever, the woke is more correct than the shit lib, right? It's always the way, right? The woke is more correct.
Lindsay's going into his Mad Macbeth arc. Hang those that talk of fear. That's essentially what his position will become.
Anyway, yes, Robin Day, he just exists as an avatar of a more civilized time and a better age in my mind, even though I never saw him.
Just in brief contrast to that, I was going to say the next person you'll see after Robin Day in this clip is a TV presenter called Sue Lawley. She'll be brushing her hair. I don't know if do you know about the sort of the salacious story about Sue Lawley?
No.
It's a sort of, you can look this up online, but apparently there's a sort of urban legend, but there's a lot of people who talk about it online, and the story gets a little bit varied. But Sue Lawley was a bit of a saucy thing back when she was at the BBC, at BBC Television Centre. I mean, the BBC literally did a documentary on this a few years ago about how at the old television centre in Shepherd's Bush, it was a hive of sex and villainy. Now, we obviously know about things like Jimmy Savile and all of that stuff, but just the ordinary staff as well were just sort of shagging constantly. And the story about Sue Lawley is that she did a show, and she was still a TV show, and she was still mic'd up afterwards. And apparently she got into a broom cupboard with one of the sound engineers and started, they started going at it. And but her mic was still live, so it was feeding back the sound to the gallery. And the famous quote that she's meant to have said in the sort of throes of passion, I'll abbreviate this because we're before the watershed, but she apparently said, F me till I fart. And it's out there. If you look it up, F me till I fart, Sue Lawley. There's a lot of people who recall this particular story, and it was parodied by Chris Morris, I think, in On the Hour at one point. So it was a kind of common knowledge urban legend about Sue Lawley and her naughty habits.
Wow. Now, was she the one who did?
She does Island Discs, yeah.
Yeah, she was
Mr. Respectable BBC. Yeah.
Interesting, yes. Speaking of broom cupboards, we forgot to mention, of course, that Brooker married the Blue Peter girl.
Connie Huck, yeah. That's right. Yeah.
Does she still do TV then, or did she just kind of dwindle into a housewife, as the feminists say?
It's possible, but as you say, that a lot of that scene have kind of dwindled out of sight. And Brooker, obviously, people. I mean, it's like I quote tweeted Armando Iannucci the other day. Well, a lot of these people have gone off to HBO and Netflix and got multi-million-pound contracts. So the kind of BBC did them a service, sort of setting their careers up, but they're off to America now. So, I mean, they're all multimillionaires.
People saying that the next time I go on Lotus Eaters, I should wear a bow tie. Unfortunately, the libertarians have destroyed the bow tie, haven't they, Simon?
Well, with respect to our friend Radlib, who wears it with eminent panache. Other than that, yes, it can look a bit Madsen Peary and those sorts of people, can't it?
This is a short and possibly unfair.
There she is, by the way.
Oh, bit of sauce.
Sue Lawley. Okay.
Yeah.
History of the rise and fall of the television journalist as a hero. If you go back 50 years, television journalists were creeps, above all to politicians. They followed the rule of their boss, Lord Reith. The BBC, he said, is for the people. The government is for the people, so it follows that the BBC must be for the government.
Well now, Mr. Eden.
I love that. I love that logic. I love that logic.
And look at the interviewer as well. He's almost the mirror image of Eden, but 20 years younger. The hair, the moustache.
Maybe it was a better age. I want to go back on my communist arc. I want to remember this. I want to go back to this.
Above all, to politicians. They followed the rule of their boss, Lord Reith. The BBC, he said, is for the people. The government is for the people, so it follows that the BBC must be for the government.
Well now, Mr. Eden, with your very considerable experience of foreign affairs, it's quite obvious that I should start by asking you something about the international situation today, or perhaps you would prefer to talk about home. When shall it be?
Your very considerable experience of foreign affairs, i.e. messing up Suez. And that little clip there of the lady, the polarized clip of the lady running down a corridor, that's actually Television Centre with the famous circular corridors. So a young lady running away from the camera. It's a very telling piece of footage.
You're being griped, by the way, Simon, by
Hector
Drummond. He's saying that you're bringing too much lowbrow slop and salacious gossip.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Hector Drummond, where is he now, eh?
With the questioning of authority in the 1960s, this began to change. But it was Watergate that transformed everything. Two journalists, Woodward and Bernstein, exposed corruption at the highest level of the US government. And suddenly, television journalists realized what they had been born to do: to expose the dark heart of government, big business and bureaucracy. It was the start of a heroic age in which television journalists...
Go on.
Just to also add in there that Woodward and Bernstein, All the President's Men, very good film if you want to watch it. Robert Redford giving a very charismatic performance. That was 1972, obviously about the Watergate break-in. The interesting thing that happens in 1971, the year before, is you have Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers, and he wasn't a journalist. He was an analyst at our old friends, the Rand Corporation, a government, defense strategist. And he released a bunch of papers from the Pentagon, which basically exposed the White House's actual agenda for the Vietnam War from since it started until that present moment, and how successive presidents had essentially, contradicted their statements to the people about the war. And the actual assessment of the Pentagon was it essentially couldn't be sustained. They knew, it had to end, but essentially LBJ, people like that, sort of lied to the nation. And inured them to more cost and more loss, I think, as he said in a clip once, because obviously it was doing great things for the American defense industry at that time. But that was the sort of, a big sort of major breach that happened before the idea of these heroic journalists took it forward as a kind of a new mode.
Now, do you think that one thing that Trump may have done is destroyed the myth and the legacy of Watergate and what they did to Nixon? Because I think these days you would see what happened to Nixon as essentially a regime hit job.
Yeah.
And what Trump did, because notably Trump had Roger Stone there, didn't he, by his side, who was Nixon's, one of Nixon's campaign guys. What Trump did was take all of the stuff they tried to do to Nixon and just survived it, just didn't give in, didn't fall on his sword, didn't give up. And it has been suggested by quite a few Republicans since then. I think Tucker Carlson did an entire show on this at one point, basically saying that all of this that Curtis is mythologizing here is bollocks. This is just kind of like, this was just the regime's, the left-wing establishment's way of getting rid of, somebody who represented the American people. And then they basically twisted the Republican Party into being the Ronald Reagan thing, the classical liberal plus hawkish foreign policy thing that we know and love today. And funny enough, I think they've done the same thing to MAGA, but that's a different story. But yeah, I mean, it's the point is that we've seen worse things than Watergate. What they did to Trump, what Obama and friends did to Trump, was probably like 10 Watergates, and yet there was no Nixon moment for any of those. So
the Teflon Don.
Okay, let's carry on.
Revealed the sinister forces that we couldn't see, and those in power wanted to hide from us. Out of it came much great journalism. But then an event happened that made it clear that despite their heroic confidence, the journalists didn't know everything. The Berlin Wall suddenly collapsed. It was one of the biggest events of the 20th century, and none of them had seen it coming.
Here is a brick from the Berlin Wall, a souvenir from your trip here.
Jens Reich, look at it and tell us what you think tonight.
With the end of the Cold War, the TV journalists were thrown into a new and terrifying world, where all the old certainties of good and bad, right and left, began to blur in an unnerving way. And it destroyed their ability to tell us their simple moral fables. So as a way out, they came up with a new theory. They had actually been patronizing and elitist when they had lectured us about corruption in high places. Instead, all stories in future should reflect our experience, and attempts to explain why things happen were abandoned. A classic example was a new type of investigative journalist, Donal McIntyre. He set out to show what it was like to get mugged. He took his mobile phone onto the streets of Brixton. For 3 nights he desperately tried to get it snatched, until finally someone gave him his story.
Sorry, I'm looking for Stockwell Tube. Stockwell Tube. Phone. Oh, fucking hell! Oh, my mobile's gone! My mobile's gone! My mobile's gone!
And as Donal cried, we knew that he was sharing our pain.
Pause. I mean, that's great, that stuff, isn't it? And as Donal cried, apparently on that incident, I read up about it. I never saw the original program, but he'd also he was carrying around a laptop very conspicuously. And people said that when he was out on the beat in Brixton trying to get his phone nicked, what he would do, he would answer the phone and hold it sort of 3 feet in front of him every time he answered the phone, just wanting to get it snatched. And apparently when the phone was snatched, I think he managed to track back to a flat somewhere in Brixton, the guy who had the phone. And I think they may have taken the camera crew there to try and get the phone back. And he got to the flat and they pinched his laptop as well. So it's this experiential, subjectivized journalism that happened at that period. I mean, I talked about it last time. The sort of confessional confessional columns of people like John Diamond, Ruth Pickedy, this sort of, I've got cancer, I'm writing about facing death, all that kind of elevation of suffering, pain, and that as an attempt again to sort of mine the psyche of the audience. I said before about the theory in performance acting, is you find pain and damage and you use that to energize performance. So there's a relation there.
I feel like a lot of women do this sort of journalism. Even now, I see a lot of women's columns are basically like, as a woman, Let me tell you how I've experienced this.
Literally, Jess Phillips overnight.
Yeah, I mean, even Jess Phillips, as a government minister, is doing it now.
Yeah,
the story about the grooming gangs is not what happened to all those girls, and it's not. It is how Elon Musk is making Jess Phillips feel. That's the story.
Yeah. Me with my phalanx of armed police officers and my government security detail, I'm feeling really unsafe.
I had a horrible moment of realization when I was watching that Jess Phillips clip. That well, let's save that for another day.
There was one final step in this transformation of journalism. You cut out the middleman, the journalist.
If you've got a story to tell, we'd love to hear from you. The email address, as always, yournews.
Commentators, who are they? Well, they're you.
Now, our presenters plead with us to send in our photos and videos. They proudly present it as a new kind of open democracy. But in reality, it's something very different. Because the journalists don't understand what is going on in today's complex, chaotic world, they have had to revert to their old habit of finding someone in authority who will tell them. But this time, it's not the politicians, it's us, the audience, that they've turned to. The only problem is that we don't have a clue what's going on, particularly because the journalists have given up on their job of explaining the world to us.
And now think about Twitter, think about social media, think about journalism now. How many articles have you read which is just a report of what's happened on Twitter?
Yeah, well, this is an interesting thing. I mean, because Curtis is very scathing about social media. He actually has some interesting comments. I mean, for instance, I'll just sort of bring these quotes up. He doesn't like bloggers at all. Reference my friend Hector Drummond there in the chat, who was one of the original bloggers way back. He has some interesting things to say about social media in this light. He says, first of all, he says Twitter is, quote, a self-aggrandizing smug pressure group.
Yes,
which may well appeal to you right now, having left Twitter, because in a sense it is that thing I think you talked about recently in office hours about it's Twitter's not reality. It's where a number of us are, but it's not what most people are looking at or thinking about.
Yes.
He says on bloggers, he says, first of all, the people who do blogging, for example, are self-selecting. And quite frankly, it's quite clear that what bloggers are is bullies. The internet has removed a lot of constraints on them. You know what they're like. They're deeply emotional, they're bullies, and they often don't get out enough. And they are parasitic upon already existing sources of information. They do little research of their own. What then happens is this idea of the, quote, hive mind. Instead of leading to a new plurality or a new richness, it leads to a growing simplicity. The bloggers from one side try to force mainstream media one way, the others try to force it the other way. So what the mainstream media ends up doing is it nervously tries to steer a course between these two polarized extremes. And I suppose for bloggers, you're going to read Substackers now. So I mean that's Curtis's position, which is pretty scathing on what I do consider actually a lot of great work comes out of nowadays.
Well, what I do like about Curtis here is that this is kind of just balls out elitism.
Yes,
it's just all out paternalistic elitism.
Yes,
people need guidance. They need to be told what's happening, and it's really the responsibility of the priest class to tell them what is happening in the world, and they've given up on their responsibilities.
He does. He does. He literally explicitly confirms that in interviews as well. It's the idea that we have drifted away from the big narratives or the confidence to make big narratives, and the problem is that leaves people adrift and afraid in the current world.
It is interesting. All right, shall we move? That was only very short, so shall we move to the next one?
Yeah.
Which is Odism.
Now, are you finding the world's news too scary and depressing to bear?
Yes.
Do you tune in and simply think, oh dear?
Yeah.
Yeah, I know you do, because I am you dickhead. Dickhead.
All right.
Anyway, we've got a short film now on that very subject from Adam Curtis. Would you like to see it?
Go on then.
Yeah, I thought you might, but before I show it to you, I've been asked to point something out in case you mistake views for facts. The following is a short film by the documentary maker Adam Curtis, the man behind The Power of Nightmares, The Century of the Self and The Trap. It represents his personal and some might say controversial viewpoint. It's therefore his viewpoint. It's his viewpoint. It's his viewpoint. It's a man's viewpoint. It's not a big bunch of facts carved into a concrete block by a fact computer, all right? It's one man's viewpoint. Are you ready for it?
Yes.
Good. Here we go.
Everyone knows that television news can be boring. That's because it's often about politics, which can be very dull.
This unprecedented aid for Scottish mining, and no one else is getting it, comes at a time when the indicators show some difficulties for Labour in Scotland.
Return. I want it back.
It's funny. I try to when we see bits of footage, I do try to sort of take screenshots and track back where this sort of footage comes from. I couldn't track down who this guy was. He was clearly a BBC presenter, back in what looks like the early 70s by his dress. And I tried doing screenshot searches, reverse image searches, and the only things I could come up with that matched were shots from Monty Python's Flying Circus.
Interesting.
But this is the talks that Curtis was giving at the time of this documentary, 2009, 2010, was Curtis. He was reacting against news as fragmented events and presented to us in this way where that you can see the contradictions over the course of a week or even in a story. As it's written in he was talking about, I'm reading an article in The Economist, and it contradicted itself from the beginning to the end. And he talks about these fragments washing over us. He says, quote, like waves in a fever. They're not put together as narrative frameworks anymore in these bigger stories, but they're just these sort of transient symptoms of the modern world. And at this point, he was saying things that everything in the news was interference, gibberish, noise. And he felt that something new was coming, a way of taking the gibberish and stitching it back together and explaining why it had become gibberish. And he saw it as a potentially liberating moment where, people could, he felt people would do things like play footage long and take the fragments and reconstruct them and tell more imaginative stories. And around this time, by the way, it's people like Joe Rogan were actually starting to podcast in long form as well. So there was that drift towards an authenticity that was built out of just giving you the raw stuff. Another interesting fact when I Googled that stuff about Joe Rogan, it also came up with his IQ is 127. Just thought I had to mention that. But Curtis is expressing this time. He was basically shocked by the left's failure to offer an alternative story about what is going on, and to use that metaphor from previously to build some new scenery. He said the left is trapped in the idea of being rebellious, and that leads nowhere.
Interesting. Very interesting. This chap we're looking at, by the way, I love the idea that he's slightly tobacco stained.
It's extravagant hair as well.
It's kind of yellow, but the hair is yellowing. Kind of. I've always loved that idea of the slightly yellowing tobacco stained. From this era. But anyway,
great character. Yeah.
Let's carry on.
Book him, Dino.
But these days, there is another problem with watching the news. Night after night, we are shown pictures of terrible things which we feel we can do nothing about. Images of civil wars, massacres, and starving children, which leave us feeling helpless and depressed, and to which the only response is, oh dear. There is a name for this. It's called Odism. And this is the story of the rise of Odism in television news.
Sorry to break it up again. What he talks about a lot is how people are experiencing history as very dissonant to their sense of, I suppose, reality, what we'd call lived experience now. And it's almost that history becomes almost like, as it's presented in the media, in news, as a kind of, it's like ASMR. It's like a sort of, you get a physiological response to it. You get a certain tingling. It flags certain emotional modes for you to sit within, and and in a detached way, and what Curtis is about is trying to create an emotional connection to events, asking you to sort of involve yourself and not just regard news as spectacle. I mean, I referred to sort of Guy Debord earlier on, and Debord has this quote: "Passive identification with the spectacle supplants genuine activity." And even though that's an academic reference, Curtis disavows a lot of academic references, but really what he does is he's popularizing them by, instead of talking about this era of spectacle, he'll call it Odism, this passivity where the only response is to be exasperated. So he doesn't like what he calls obscurantism. But interestingly, I mean, he does a lot of what Guy Debord does. Guy Debord has this concept of détournement, which is where you hijack images to comment on the ideology. And that's exactly what Curtis does.
Yes, and Debord, of course, was pretty influential on Mr. Nothing Ever Happens himself, who we talked about before, Baudrillard, right? The Gulf War never took place, etc. And there's a lot of that in Curtis as well, isn't there? There's a lot of the, he's, if he is anywhere, he's close to those people.
The concepts are definitely there. I mean, he talks about Foucault. He says, people say, "Oh, you must have read Foucault." And I say, well, yeah, I tried it. And what he's saying is so mind-crushingly banal, you could say it in one page. I hate all this because what all these things do is they literally cut people off. They frighten people because they are deliberately obscure. And I don't like that. I think you can take anything, however complicated, and make it simple and approachable and emotional as well as intellectual. So I mean, in a sense, what you do on this channel is you popularize, but it's different from what Curtis is doing. I think he sort of gatekeeps you from looking too hard at the academic angle, and keeps you within a popularized sense of what that is. But whereas I think you're not trying to obscure the academic.
Well, what Curtis is saying is right in a sense, but there's a much quicker way of saying it. The problem with Foucault, Debord, Baudrillard, Althusser, the problem with all of them is that they were French, Simon. Right? And a Frenchman, for some reason, loves to take like 40 pages to say something that you can say in 3 lines, right? Which is what Curtis is saying.
Yes.
And what I did a lot in my, not only on this channel, but in my actual academic career, was just like, I'll give you the 1-page summary of what this 40-page of fucking waffling is about.
Yes.
Because I don't know why the French are like that. I don't know if it's a deliberate style or a translation issue or whatnot, but there's I can give you like Derrida, it's like, well, yeah, at a certain point language stops being able to connote, Simon, okay?
Yes.
And eventually meaning starts breaking down.
Yes.
Do you understand that?
Yes.
Right now I'm going to point that out over and over and over again using different examples. For 400 pages.
Exactly. I mean, as people have obviously watched these streams, I mean, I've brought in some of this, cultural theory language from the left, hauntology, jouissance, détournement, all this stuff. I mean, I find some of the taxonomies interesting and useful, and maybe you can repurpose them. But as you say, they're sort of crowded around with a lot of I mean, I tried reading Jacques Lacan once, and I just couldn't get anywhere with it. It was just a block of granite that just resisted attempts to sort of make it empirical and easy.
At a certain age, Simon, you were aware that the thing in the mirror is a reflection of you, and thus symbolism is born in your mind.
Blimey,
this is something to do with Lacan. I seem to remember.
Yeah.
But it's like, how can I put this? So often the grain of what they're saying is something as banal as that,
Yeah.
I mean, in Foucault's case, it's like, well, knowledge, discourse, and power always go hand in hand together, and who controls discourse and language controls the field of knowledge, and therefore has power in any given epistemic moment, something like this. It's like, well, and then most of the work is just examples of that happening, or you can see it in the panopticon, or you can see it when somebody has their skin branded when they become a prisoner, blah 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 blah. Anyway, let us move on.
Just one last note before we do. Just want to do a music note here. There's a catchy little tune there that's playing. It's a version of the Hawaii 5-0 theme by a dub reggae act called The Instigators, which was released in 1984. Just a catchy tune. That's all.
I should mention the ultimate book, which could be literally just one page of A4. In fact, it could probably just be like 3 mathematical formulas, right? Is Jean-Paul Sartre's Being and Nothingness. Have you ever tried to read that book?
No.
That is a maddeningly repetitive book. He wrote it in a cafe in Paris. And I mean, it's like banging your head against a brick wall. He just says the same thing over and over and over again about being and becoming, and I'm the for itself, and I am the in, the in itself, and I don't know why they have to speak like this, right? But anyway, yeah,
like you said,
the actual ideas of being and nothingness are literally like 3 points, 3 bullet points. Anyway,
it's the Frenchness. Take the David Starkey position on the French, basically.
Yeah, exactly. I do blame the French for a lot of those, and this is one of the reasons I love a writer like Carl Schmitt, right? Carl Schmitt. It's like, what? That's the book. It's only about 10 pages long. Yeah, but it's it like that. It's so elegant. It's just like you're there. You don't. All right. That's the what? It's just, the only idea is friend enemy. Oh, all right. You're not going to say anything else? No. Oh, great. Fucking brilliant. I love Carl Schmitt. Anyway, let's carry on.
It began with the rise of the counterculture in the 1960s. The radicals believed that all politics was corrupt because it always involved power.
Bring the police. Send for the police quickly. Cut your hair.
The radicals wanted to find a new way to connect directly with the dispossessed in the world, bypassing politicians. Their chance came in 1968 with the Biafran Civil War in Africa. Western politicians were doing nothing as thousands starved. So
now this is going to sound insensitive, Simon, but it's something I've always wondered. And I thought there's no better time than to ask it in front of an audience of 2,000 people. Why don't Africans just wipe the flies away? Because if I'm here now, if a fly comes to me, I can't fucking stand it. I'm like, get away, right?
Yeah.
But there, it's just like, there's 6 of them on my forehead. Just wipe it away, man.
To be fair, I will say, linking in with my defense industry experience and special forces people and all that stuff, they do a lot of training in the jungle when they select for special forces, and I think they talk about the way you have to deal with living in those kinds of climates is just to accept the leeches and the flies and everything, and in a sense you blank them out at a certain point. And that's kind of there's some sort of environmental conditioning that just eventually crushes
you're so used to it, you're immune to it, you just can't
accept the misery and the crotch rotting infections and the parasites and the dengue fever.
I probably have to move, to be honest. I'm not a big insect guy. I'm down on. I hate slugs. I don't like creepy crawlies. I don't like apart from, I've learned to love spiders because they destroy they're kind of allies in the great struggle against the insect. So I kind of accept a couple of little spiders around.
I must say, I do. This is one of the Curtis tropes here that whenever he's doing a documentary and then he drifts into this kind of handheld footage of Africa, you always tense up a bit, don't you? Because you think, oh, I'm going to see dead bodies in a minute. I'm going to see people.
He's quite raw on that sort of stuff, isn't he?
Yeah, and it is. I mean, looking at these poor kids malnourished. I mean, it is horrific, but it obviously leads into what he's going to say about Western philanthropy.
A group of radicals began a campaign to rescue the dying children. Propaganda films were made that portrayed the conflict dramatically as a new Holocaust. Celebrities held 48-hour vigils, and television news eagerly covered it. And then Blue Peter held an appeal for Biafra. And the response astonished everyone.
We asked for 144,000 parcels, and you'll never guess just how many we got. We got 1,444,000, and that is 10 times more than our actual target.
What Biafra began reached its high point in 1985 with Live Aid.
Can I just say something, Simon, right? One of the real kind of holy shit moments in the history of this channel that I've had is when I made that video on the economic history of Ethiopia. Right? Do you remember I made that whole series about the
Liberia,
Liberia, etc. Well, obviously I grew up in the 80s, and I remember, like, we're constantly reminded every Christmas about Live Aid, etc. One thing that they always neglected to mention is that the famine in Ethiopia came as the result of a communist takeover and hardcore Marxist-Leninist land reforms that were done by the government of Ethiopia. That bit of the story was never told to me when I was a kid. I had to find it out many years later, making a YouTube video. And this is the sort of thing. It's like even somebody as switched on and aware as me can go that long without realizing what the actual cause of the famine was. You know what I mean? It's like it's remarkable, really.
Yeah, totally. I mean, this is it's this moment where you have this contrast that Curtis shows here between when charity, back in the 60s and 70s, charity had this sort of had a sort of dutiful quality. We did these things to help people out in other countries because it was the right thing to do, and they were suffering terribly. And I remember things like when I was a kid in the 70s, you had on Blue Peter, they would have like the bicycles for Cambodia. And John Pilger came on and talked about, well, this would make a real difference to people if, we gave money so they could buy bicycles in Cambodia. When Pol Pot had, taken over, and made it into Kampuchea or whatever it was. And there was things like that. And there was a sort of, and Blue Peter would do things like, have a bring and buy sale, in your village and donate the proceeds. And it was this kind of, sweet kind of British amateurism about it. And contrast that with this, and you get this sort of the surly figure of Bob Geldof with his kind of his accusatory, pained expressions on the stage. He's prowling around with this sort of angry self-importance, and the whole event is supercharged with a kind of mass social validation exercise, inconspicuous charity.
Where was Thatcher just saying, like, yes, you should give these people help, but never forget this was caused by communism? Like, why was that not just front and center? Like, why? I mean, because there's the accusatory look of Geldof, right, and the sense I always got growing up, right, and it was that like, oh well, these people are less fortunate than you, and therefore it's somehow your fault. Like, it's somehow your fault that these kids in Africa are starving, right? But actually, it was the fault of the government of Ethiopia for being fucking communists, and this is the bit, the missing cause. And it's like one of the greatest swindles ever. Because it's just not mentioned.
And Live Aid absolutely was massive. I mean, I was living in Australia at the time, and I sort of saw, the simulcasts of the concerts and so on. And one of the big things about this, that one of the big sort of headlines was this famine was happening right now, and with the money from this, they were going to literally load up trucks with grain or whatever, food supplies, and get it out to these starving people in Ethiopia. And for weeks afterwards, the news was, to a point, tracking, because we were all on tenterhooks. When are these trucks going to get there? When they're going to feed these starving people? And that news just kind of dwindled away. And you sort of went, oh, I wonder what happened with all those aid trucks, because we were expecting these lines of aid trucks to rush in and save everybody's lives, and it just kind of dwindled and died. And of course, what happened is Colonel Mengistu took the trucks and sold off the aid to buy arms from the Soviets, and that was quietly put to one side. I think some of the money did eventually get to some places, but what Mengistu did was he used it to buy off areas where he was fighting the rebels in Tigray, and he used the promise of the aid to keep people on side and not support those particular rebels. So there was a, I mean, as I say, he's completely ruthless. This guy.
But where was the documentary to go along with Geldof on the Ethiopian Red Terror, for example? It just wasn't even mentioned. Nobody was aware of it. It was just like, this is just some natural disaster happening, and this is just some tragedy that's occurring. I mean, at least you could say with what's happening in the Middle East today that nobody is in any two minds about why it's happening, right? It's also blatant. So there's that political element in there. But here with Live Aid, it's all stripped out. It's all just like, and this was right in the middle of the Cold War as well. I've never understood the dynamics around that. And I actually lay it on Thatcher and co. They should have been, rather than just surrendering the culture to Geldof and friends, they should have allowed, like, she was the prime minister. She should have just been saying every single day, remember, if you don't want to be like that, socialism, kids, it's not for winners or whatever. Like, whether it was true or not, that's the political element of it, and it's just missing from the whole story. Anyway, let's continue.
Thanks for coming. Michael Burke's news reports of the Ethiopian famine had shocked the West. Bob Geldof then used television to create an extraordinary event of global altruism. It showed that we together could do more to save the world than our ineffectual and corrupted politicians.
Soon we'll be learning, and the lesson today is how to die.
And it also made us feel good about ourselves. Those running Live Aid thought that they had transcended the corruption of politics. But actually, the money they raised may have had its own corrupting and destructive effects in Africa. The dictator of Ethiopia, Colonel Mengistu, was fighting a civil war.
Based Curtis for actually reminding people of what was actually fucking happening in Ethiopia. Well done, Curtis.
Yeah.
And some have claimed that he used Western aid to fund the war and to prolong it for a further 6 years.
Live Aid was actually used for war munitions.
It actually literally supercharged, give war a chance, as they say in the defense industry.
But we need to go back to that kind of self-important, holier-than-thou look that Bob Geldof was giving.
Striding around in your jeans, and accusatory look at the audience. The lesson today is how to die.
Médecins Sans Frontières has said that this may have led to as many deaths as were actually saved by the aid. But this wasn't reported because it was too complicated, and it wouldn't have made us feel good about ourselves.
Go on.
Then, in 1989, the West won the Cold War. The old political story of left versus right was finished.
Pause.
But reporters...
Just to do a little end cap on the Live Aid stuff there was an interesting bit I found out about Live Aid, about Bob Dylan, when he performed.
Yes, I remember, yeah.
There's a quote about it. He performed When the Ship Comes In. And he said, this generated controversy, apparently. He said, I hope that some of the money that's raised for the people in Africa, maybe they can take just a little bit of it, maybe 1 or 2 million, maybe, and use it, say, to pay the mortgages on some of the farms that the farmers here in the US owe to the banks. And he also said, let me see, he's misquoted on the Farm Aid website as saying, wouldn't it be great if we did something for our own farmers right here in America? So they twisted it. And essentially Geldof sort of went mad at this. And he said, Dylan displayed a complete lack of understanding of the issues raised by Live Aid. Live Aid was about people losing their lives. There's a radical difference between losing your livelihood and losing your life. But this did actually set up something called Farm Aid in America.
Yes, I was aware of this. Yeah, and of course, Dylan's actual appearance at Live Aid is something worth watching because he's completely in a world of his own and is clearly not part of the virtue signaling set in any single respect. But
Geldof said it was crass, stupid, and nationalistic of him to say that.
Yeah, Dylan has always had this. I mean, what's the American equivalent of a Little England approach? But he's kind of like, he has always been a bit of an America firster, with a special carve out for a certain country in the Middle East. If you listen to Infidels album, or is it? There's something called Union Sundown. That album is basically like Dylan doing like Dylan as a Reaganite, basically. He's just kind of, I've long suspected that Dylan is a Republican.
Yeah,
that he votes Republican, and that later on the album Tempest, there's a song which was widely taken as an oblique attack on Obama, where he, you won't tell us who your father is and all this sort of stuff. Dylan, I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if we found out one day that Dylan voted for Trump. I really wouldn't. But anyway, let's carry on. If people haven't seen Dylan at Live Aid, it's worth tracking down that footage, because you can just tell he's not with the rest of the rock stars there at all.
Still needed a grand, simple story about the world, into which all the chaotic events and fragments of stuff that happen every day could be fitted. And waiting in the wings was the hippie counterculture view of the world, a view which saw everything.
People are talking about Dylan now. The thing is about his Christian period, it never really officially ended. I mean, his music went in a different direction, but there was never a point where Dylan said, I no longer am a Christian, or I no longer believe in God, or whatever. So he never walked back any of that stuff. And as far as I can tell, Dylan, I mean, obviously, he's not like, just as far as I can tell, if his politics are any way, he's kind of a type of American patriot or something like that, but with a few caveats, bearing in mind his heritage and so on.
Thing as a struggle between innocent individuals and corrupt political systems, and TV news embraced it eagerly. And it worked. From the glorious revolutions in Eastern Europe, to the brave students in Tiananmen Square, through to the plucky Bosnians in the horror of Sarajevo, television news told a story of noble individuals bravely standing up against bad political systems. But this simple battle between good and evil couldn't last, and it finally cracked back where it first began, in Africa. In 1994, the Hutus massacred millions of Tutsis in Rwanda. In the wake of the massacres, millions of refugees flooded into the Congo. Western aid workers and television crews.
There's your dead body, Simon.
Yeah,
matter of time, really. He really likes that, doesn't he? For some reason, likes including it.
Yeah,
there's probably some Brechtian reason for it,
It does. It is like the sort of the alienation effect in reverse. It drags you, snaps you right back to reality outside of his kind of hypnotic montage.
Also flooded in to help the innocent victims. But they soon discovered that many of them weren't innocent at all. They were the evil Hutus who had killed millions of the Tutsis.
When people crossed the border, we all knew very well that among them there were murderers. There were people that were helping. Every time we give out food, every time we give health services, we know that among the people that we're helping, there are murderers.
Then the Tutsis invaded.
This is kind of based from Curtis, by the way. This is like him just shining a light on this in particular.
Yeah.
If he did that today, or if he'd done that, maybe not today, but if he'd done it 5 years ago, like if he'd brought this out on Charlie Brooker in 2020, as opposed to in this moment in 2008 or whenever it was, he'd have been called alt-right without doubt for shining attention on these kind of narrative incongruities or whatever.
Yeah,
the there is left this.
Yeah, there is only the one story about Rwanda. I suppose it's the Hotel Rwanda or whatever. It's the one side bad, the other side good, etc.
And of course, let us not forget Southport. Let's not forget what happened last year. This had serious consequences down the line. The wrong source of Rwandan being allowed in, for example.
The plucky Welsh Rwandans.
The camps to get their revenge. But instead of behaving like good victims, they too carried out terrible massacres. And a horrific war began in which 4.5 million people died, and everyone was evil, even the children. And that had a terrible effect on television news. Because when there weren't any good or innocent people to support any longer, the kind of news reporting invented in the 90s made no sense. Because the news had given up reporting them as political struggles, it meant there was now no way to understand why these terrible events were happening. And instead, political conflicts around the world, from Darfur to Gaza, are now portrayed to us as simple illustrations of the mindless cruelty of the human race, about which nothing can be done, and to which the only response is, oh dear. It's like living in the mind of a depressed hippie.
So, there we go. Interesting how it depoliticizes it, though, isn't it?
Yeah. I think you'll definitely see that later on. I think when he does All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace, he expatiates on Rwanda and adopts that value-free analysis. I should think up to a point anyway.
So in the interest of time, there's two more of these. There's Odism Part 2, and there's the Richard Nixon one. Let's get the Nixon one out of the way.
Yeah.
This is a film about how all of us have become Richard Nixon. Just like him, we have all become paranoid weirdos. It's the story of how television and newspapers did this to us, and how it has paralyzed the ability of politics to transform the world for the better. Once upon a time, politicians believed they could change the world. One of them was a Labour MP called Roy Jenkins.
An attitude of conservatism would be very unbecoming to the Labour movement. We exist to change society.
In the 60s, Jenkins radically reformed Britain. He used his power as Home Secretary to help get rid of laws against homosexuality.
Thanks, Roy.
Abortion and divorce.
Oh, brilliant. Well done, Roy.
If you want to be entertained, go away after this and look at some pictures online of the young Roy Jenkins. And I challenge you, if you don't find he has the face of an absolute slimeball traitor. I mean, he makes Peter Mandelson look trustworthy, when you have a look at his visage.
And oversaw the end of the death penalty.
God, another fucking belter. Oh, it's a string of wins for Roy Jenkins.
Yeah.
One of the things that I really dislike, right, is how rapidly it happens that these laws are changed by somebody like this, and then forever are put beyond the pale.
Yes.
It's like, bringing back the death penalty would be like walking back to the medieval era, not to 1962 or something. Yeah. Back to the medieval era, Yes. This happened. The most rapid example of it was when they legalized gay marriage in both Britain under Cameron and in America. It was like, that was an issue that went from being live to being, now it's decided forever. Now, like all conservatives everywhere give up on that issue forever. It's beyond the pale now. Isn't that right, Tory boy? Isn't that right, Harry and Gladive? Isn't that right, Vanishing Point, or all of the other Tory boys? It's just a dead issue. It's automatically a dead issue that's, we should forget it forever.
Yeah.
The only issue they didn't do that with, funny enough, was on abortion in America, the Roe versus Wade deal. And even that has got a slimeball psyop reason for it, which people can look into in their own time. But I just find it fascinating that it's like, all right, this dude changed the law.
Yeah,
that's it. We never have to revisit that ever again.
That's the one word I never hear in the mouths of the Tory boys is the word repeal. Nobody ever talks about the repeal of law. That's presumably the job of parliaments is to make and unmake laws, but we never see these laws unmade. I mean, Jenkins. I guess I have to sort of, he lifted the restrictions on theatre censorship, so maybe I have to give him that. I don't know, but he got rid of birching, which was a judicial punishment for juveniles and adults. That was actually abolished in the late 40s, but it remained on the books till about 62. Interestingly, though, I found that the Isle of Man kept birching for young offenders until 1976.
Interesting.
So
take that, Roy. I think Roy Jenkins is one of the great villains. Maybe we should do like a special on Roy Jenkins at one point.
He's horrible. He was a mega Europhile. He was the first British president of the European Commission. He lost his seat to George Galloway eventually in 1987, and in the late 90s he was an advisor to the Dark Lord himself, and he chaired a commission on electoral reform. He was a philanderer. He was thought to be bisexual, based on the fact that he had affairs with his male buddies at Oxford, and then
now we find out the guy who legalized homosexuality.
Yeah,
comes out.
This Vernon Bogdanor, a political scientist at Oxford, has a lot of complimentary things to say about him. He says Roy Jenkins was both radical and contemporary, and this made him the most influential exponent of the progressive creed in politics in post-war Britain. Moreover, the political creed for which he stood belongs as much to the future as to the past, for Jenkins was the prime mover in the creation of a form of social democracy which, being internationalist, is peculiarly suited to the age of globalization, and, being liberal, will prove to have more staying power than the statism of Lionel Jospin or the corporatist socialism of Gerhard Schroeder. Roy Jenkins was the first leading politician to appreciate that a liberalized social democracy must be based on two tenets, what Peter Mandelson called the aspirational society. Individuals must be allowed to regulate their personal lives without interference from the state, and that a post-imperial country like Britain could only be influential in the world as part of a wider grouping, the European Union.
Ugh. This is what wrecked the left, in my opinion. This social liberal bullshit from correct me if I'm wrong, but was Roy Jenkins later one of the
Gang of Four,
so-called Gang of Four that created the SDP and then the Lib Dems?
David Owen, Shirley Williams, and I think Bill Rogers, and the short-lived SDP, which is now being revived by Mr. William Clouston. I don't know how much in sympathy he is with Roy Jenkins. I think he is not a fan of the EU. So maybe the policy stack has changed somewhat since Jenkins's time. But as you say, I mean, in a way, Roy Jenkins is kind of forgotten by people below a certain age, like most people now.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. He needs to have the light shine on him because
exactly. Yeah. Name those guilty men.
And women.
Yeah.
What was her name? Shirley
Williams.
Don't know. Make the Labour Party Marxist again. Oh no, let's carry on.
The press and much of the public hated it. But he refused to bow down to the pressure because he was an elitist. He knew it was good for them. But then Richard Nixon came to power in America. He saw himself as an outsider, and he hated elites. He was convinced that many in the East Coast establishment secretly ran America in their own interests. Snooty academics, liberal foundations, film stars, heads of big corporations, and even the CIA. In Nixon's mind, they were all part of a hidden, corrupt network.
Well, he was right about that, wasn't he? Let's face it, he was basically right about it. Adam.
And this is interesting because I find Curtis counter-signaling this idea. But again, this goes to his opposition to conspiracy frame. As Curtis is not in favor of conspiracy frame at all. And one of the things that he says about it is he says, I mean, in an age of hyper-individualism, the problem with that is that people internalize that and they can no longer believe in collective or group actions. And that frame captures that sort of gap in perception and neutralizes it so that when you come along and say that something has happened because of connected networks, people say, oh, it's a conspiracy. And then it's
collective action, connected networks. These are all just euphemisms for the organized minority. And Adam Curtis literally just laid out Roy Jenkins operating as an organized minority using governmental power top down to enact his will.
Yes.
Right. I mean, this is what I mean. And so Richard Nixon, his articulation of this idea may be conspiratorial, but he's basically pointing to exactly that same thing. So
Yeah,
I don't really understand. Like, Adam Curtis is just, what is he, just playing semantics?
I think this is where I felt it was a sort of lazy characterization. You know, Nixon's always wheeled out as a kind of metonym for paranoid leadership. You know, I mean, looking into Nixon, obviously, I mean, maybe our friend Turnip would be a good person to have right now, but he's obviously a very complex and restrained character. He had some obvious adversity in his early life. He was kind of shunned from the sort of, you know, the country cupboard establishment, you know, university people, and you know, he had something of a persecution complex, if you like. But I don't think it's as simple as saying he was wrong about certain things. And Curtis is, as you say, he's kind of having it both ways here, because I mean, Curtis's phrase is not so much that there's a conspiracy frame. He won't embrace the kook sphere, so to speak. But he will talk about powerful vested interests, and he will say that is just the way history is. There are vested interests vying for influence and using all kinds of modes of persuasion. But it shouldn't be framed as conspiracy in the esoteric sense of conspiracy. It's just that there are powerful groups and they act in these ways. And this is largely hidden from us. And that's what he is trying to sort of show, because he often gets accused of peddling conspiracy theory. But again, he's using, as I say at the beginning, I think he was using Nixon here in a slightly provocative way to sort of shorthand the idea that he was kind of an irrational, nutty kook.
But Nixon was literally brought down by the elite, so it's like,
yes.
Well.
Yes.
All right. Let's go down.
And what's more, they were out to destroy him. So Nixon set up a covert operation to bug and smear all these enemies. But in 1972, they got caught bugging the Democrats in the Watergate building. Nixon tried to cover it up, but he was exposed by the Washington Post. As a result of Watergate, investigative journalists in America and Britain became the heroes of the age. And in the 70s, they uncovered all sorts of bad people.
That's your words.
Who often beat them up.
Do you think Charlie Brooker said, Adam, you've sent me the same film like 3 times? Are you going to make a different, like, you're going to make a different point on, you're just sending me your B cuts? Yeah, he talked about producing these films. He said basically he cut them in a weekend at home, did 2 takes on the voiceover and sent them into the BBC, you know, so they were pretty sort of briskly done. And it was at the time where editing technology was such that you could do this stuff on a laptop at a pro level. And he was sort of anticipating that, you know, lots of editing houses in Soho would go out of business, and then there'd be a sort of, much more of a flood of this kind of material that people could, you know, like, he didn't talk about citizen journalism or anything like that, but he anticipated that, you know, it was going to get much more sort of fast and loose in terms of content production. Yeah. But his next film is actually quite a step away from that, phoning it in.
But then, the journalists began to uncover the strangest thing. They found corruption in the heart of the elites who ran their country. Politicians and civil servants took bribes. The security services assassinated people illegally.
Right.
Policemen concocted evidence and sold drugs.
I'm here to look into the disturbing case of Mrs. Joyce Brown.
And even senior doctors covered up terrible mistakes. And as the journalists exposed all this, they began to sound like Richard Nixon. That there really were hidden conspiracies in the heart of the establishment.
Yes.
And then, in an even odder twist, the journalists found an unlikely ally, Mrs. Thatcher. Mrs. Thatcher wanted to roll back the power of the state. And to her, the professional elites, the civil servants, lawyers, doctors, the broadcasters, were all terrible hypocrites. They talked loudly of public duty, but secretly they were running things in their own interests. So she spent the 80s attacking these groups as a threat to Britain, helped by Rupert Murdoch, who detested elitism in Britain and America.
They hate to see someone communicating with the masses. They feel that newspapers, the written word is not for the masses. That should be left to television, or perhaps to nobody. But there's a great sort of elitism.
But then, in the 1990s, the journalists became even more like Richard Nixon. Like him, they started to see hidden enemies everywhere. They were enthusiastically supported in this by some members of the middle-class elites, doctors, psychiatrists and academics, who reinvented themselves as experts, who said that they too could identify dangers lurking just under the surface of our everyday lives that we couldn't see. Experts uncovered hidden threats like sexual abuse, paedophilia, and even networks of satanic abuse on a vast scale.
Doctor believes that many multiple personality patients were sexually abused by satanic cults.
Other experts predicted hundreds of thousands would die from the epidemic of BSE-CJD. Medical experts said that millions of people were going to die from different forms of animal flu.
Doctors have discovered a new disease which they say shows a possible link between autism and the routine childhood vaccine MMR.
Others said that thousands...
That's RFK, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Thousands of children were at risk of autism from the MMR jab. Terror experts said there was a global hidden network of sleeper cells that had the power to destroy Western society. And then it got worse. Other experts said you couldn't even trust yourself. Your own body was an enemy.
Obesity is now a disease of epidemic proportions.
It just makes you paranoid. You look at yourself in the mirror every day. I think people just think, I really want to look like that. Because it's just everywhere.
More obsessed with food.
I've actually had my stomach stapled and I'm on antidepressants.
Using all the best available science.
30 years ago, journalists bravely exposed the corruption of those in power, like Richard Nixon. But now, the news and television programs have ended up taking serious threats to society and exaggerating and distorting them.
Pause. just the sort of cruelty of that show. This mother. I mean, admittedly, she is. If you notice, you look in the footage, she's wearing like pentagram earrings. But let's pass by that. But doing this kind of computer impression of her child as he gets older, and eventually, I mean, he ends up looking like a zombie. she's just got to sit there crying as the camera does a sort of slow zoom into her pain. But on the serious point about the rule of experts, I mean, a lot of this is interesting in that it seems like it was a kind of natural outgrowth of the communications economy of the 1980s. When in the previous series, I talked, I think, a little bit about Peter York, who's a cultural commentator in the UK. And the communications experts of the 80s, everything we saw in advertising and marketing, he used the analogy of drug pushers. He called them pushers, essentially. And that there was this quality, if you like, an addictive quality of the rolling out and expression and compliance to information and to expert and credentialed information. And there's an interesting comment from the French theorist Lyotard, Jean-François Lyotard, and he says, knowledge in the form of an informational commodity indispensable to productive power is already and will continue to be a major, perhaps the major stake in the worldwide competition for power. It is conceivable that the nation states will one day fight for control of information, just as they battled in the past for control over territory, and afterwards for control of access to and exploitation of raw materials and cheap labor. I mean, he talks about fighting for information between states or even within those states, and that's something that obviously gets supercharged by the sort of the web tech acceleration at the end of the 20th century.
And we're in an info war now, aren't we, Simon?
Oh, I didn't notice. Yes, but this stuff about elitism, I think Curtis is making advocacy for the big narrative, like journalists telling the big story again, not outsourcing it back to us. And he uses examples. I mean, he does like Roy Jenkins, and Roy Jenkins he's an example of an elite. We think of elites as being right coded, but there are left coded elites as well. Doing this for your own good elites. The positive liberty elites. We're constructing the circumstances for your liberty and your freedom. But again, it's always a question of, well, who's making those choices? Who guards the guards? But what's interesting here is, society's been stripped of elitism and benchmarks, as Curtis says, so people can't judge where truth is, and this is what makes them vulnerable to myth and fear and things like the conspiracy frame at its most extreme. And he says this can make you weak. I don't think he's being Nietzschean about it. I think he's just concerned that individual agency to act politically with a sort of with a vision, a collective vision, has been neutralized. And I say that consciously because on the right, we tend to think, you hear people on sort of talk TV say, oh, collectivists, and they're always referring to, the old communist regimes. But there is a meaningful form of the collective that we have to look at, which is the society that we're trying to kind of cohere and defend. And I find it much more useful to talk about collectivities than collectivism, because collectivism is too much redolent of, collective farms in the Soviet Union and all that sort of stuff. But you do have to frame collectivity, groups with interests like us, the English, the Welsh, the Scots, the French, whoever. Collectivities do matter.
I'm a little bit confused as to what Curtis is trying to say. Like, is he saying that the experts that are presented to us are basically a form of Nixon conspiracy sold back? What is he really saying here?
I think what his view was much more tethered to experiences he had early on with the series Pandora's Box, where he looked at where science was used to try and influence society in a favorable direction. And he got in trouble at the BBC, and he was kind of hauled up before the board because they had like a scientific advisory board, and he was accused of distorting and traducing science. And he fought back, and he fiercely made the point, look, he said, scientists have been used, credentials and experts have been exploited just simply in the furtherance of political agendas. And that's my point. It's not that science is bad. Science is neutral. It can be good. It can be useful. It can be unuseful. But the point being that it is prone to manipulation. So I think he would take the view that those kinds of experts coming out of that era, the 80s and the 90s, allied with, the sort of the Band-Aid kind of sentimentality, the Live Aid sentimentality of, the 90s was going to be the caring generation, So in order to affect that, you needed this kind of phalanx of experts, to act almost as, like physicians to every kind of dimension of society, agriculture with BSE, psychologists and sociologists with regard to child behaviors and criminality and so on. So everything had to have this sort of supporting scaffolding that he is suspect. He's suspicious of.
You see, I often had this thought of the TV of this era. Everything was an expert show once you got down to it. Do you remember Kitchen Nightmares, the Gordon Ramsay?
Oh, yes.
I mean, what was Kitchen Nightmares?
Yeah.
I'm a bloke. I've got a restaurant. I don't know what the hell I'm doing. I can't cook. Expert Ramsay comes in, fixes the menu, and the moral of the Gordon Ramsay show is always the same. You listen to Gordon, you'll have success. Any deviation away from Gordon equals failure, right? The Super Nanny was the same show, if you remember, only with childcare. There was, I'm trying to remember, there was that one where the two women came in to clean the house. Do you remember that?
How yes. I know the one you mean.
There was the one with Gillian McKeith, You Are What You Eat.
Oh, God. Yeah.
Right? Any deviation away from what Gillian tells you, you're going to be fat. Yeah. I'm trying to remember some others now. I mean, this was a whole genre. Like, it wasn't just one or two shows. It was every show had the listen to the expert frame. And even in a way, the panel, the Strictly Come Dancing, the X Factor, they're all like, you've got Simon Cowell and Louis and who's the other one? Osborne, right? They're sitting there. They're the panel of experts. They judge you. Any deviation away from the advice that Simon gives you is failure, etc. He is God, basically. I mean, you even had Andrew Lloyd Webber sitting on a massive gold throne. That was only a couple of years ago. This is like a weird.
Yeah, yeah, but it all plays to this, what Curtis is anticipating, this age of mass anxiety.
And we have to remember that it was from this exact world, Simon, that we got Donald Trump.
Yeah, quite. Yeah,
as the host of The American Apprentice.
Yeah.
He was there. It was like Alan Sugar becoming the Prime Minister.
And that is again another point that Curtis has made in latter years, talking to the left especially, and saying to them, these things, these names you call these people who vote for Donald Trump, are you making the connection that because you do that, they vote for Donald Trump?
By doing this, they have created a widespread mood of fear in society and a suspicion of those who lead us.
I tell you what, one day I'm going to review that show where Andrew Lloyd Webber sat on the gold throne. What was that show called?
I don't know. That sounds amazing.
I can't believe that existed. Literally, Andrew Lloyd Webber in a massive gold throne, picking the next Maria or the next Joseph or whatever it was. That was insane, that show.
That's literally something from the mind of Chris Morris. It really is, But that it fits exactly with a phrase Curtis has used. We live in an age of decadence.
But also just just the acceptance.
Yeah.
He is God and you are a fucking peasant.
Yeah.
And when he says that you're not going to get the part, we're going to watch you drown in your tears. And we're going to sell that and the plebs are going to lap it up.
Yeah. Because part of the process...
It's fucking relentless.
Because part of the process of the social proof and the reinforcement is the humiliation ritual, isn't it?
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Kind of love it, but I also find it really dark as well. Dark.
Yeah, idiocracy type stuff. Yeah.
And in the process, millions of us have become exactly like Richard Nixon, paranoid. And if any politician tried to do what Roy Jenkins did 40 years ago, to change Britain for the better against public opinion, we and the press would destroy them. But there is one.
Well, that's the story of woke, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's the story of woke, was the left trying to go this route. Blew up in their faces, didn't it?
When social engineering goes wrong.
Well, I mean, it exactly as Adam Curtis predicted. It destroyed them. It destroyed them.
Yeah.
Difference between us and Richard Nixon. He told his psychiatrist that when he looked in the mirror in the morning, there was no one there. When we look in the mirror in the morning, we think we're too fat.
For the kids in the audience, by the way, in the 90s, that was that was considered fat. That was considered obese. All right, let's carry on. All right, so the final oh dearism.
Yeah, I think this is the best one, actually. This is the most interesting film.
Oh dearism part 2.
Yeah.
So much of the news this year has been hopeless, depressing.
Oh, look, a discredited figure from the past, Simon.
Yeah. And great visual metaphor here that is used as they're closing up this studio. You see the woman in the background with the remote control is switching off these screens. And we think they're windows, revealing the organization behind. But it's all propaganda, folks, all the way down.
Well, they're not. Oh, I didn't know that. I thought they were real people working back there.
I mean, there could be some sort of special magic window that you can just turn them off. But,
oh my god! Oh, no.
Could be. But I mean, the point is, you don't know. It's the BBC who is constructing what you see. They're selecting what you see. And again, typical Curtis point. Yeah.
And above all, confusing. To which the only
so who are the little minions working then? Do they have actors or?
Yeah. I mean, these will be like the stage crew in the news studio. They're just
but they rather than have a window through, they film it and then project the film onto that.
Yeah.
So presumably, if you watch the news long enough, it loops back round, and you'll see the same people doing the same stuff.
I mean, I think certainly in recent years they've had actually real people working in the background. They've repositioned some of the news studios. I certainly recall seeing this with the BBC, where I think there's even been sort of modest news stories about somebody's watching a rude film on a computer in the background or something like that. So they've kind of learned to sort of give it more authenticity in that sense, but never never trust what's in the frame. What's in the frame is deliberate. Anyone who watches Kubrick should know that.
Well, it's a good job that they've turned it off, because, of course, just before we went on air, he was typing on there, "Meet up later down the back of the shed." Love Hugh. Anyway, let's carry on.
No comment for any libel lawyers. Yeah.
Response is, oh dear. But what this film is going to suggest is that defeatist response has become a central part of a new system of political control.
To Hugh, live bait, 6 o'clock, love, Philip Schofield. Yeah, they're writing, on the old BBC grapevine, writing messages to each other.
How the mighty have fallen.
And to understand how this is happening, you have to look to Russia, and to a man called Vladislav Surkov, who is a hero of our time.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, Curtis returns to this chap in hypernormalization, doesn't he?
He does. And there's a lot of interesting stuff on Surkov here. I mean, I found there's a brilliant essay which I'll link to later by a chap called James Dixon. It's an essay called "Is Vladislav Surkov an Artist?" It's really, really very good. And it gives you a bit more information about Surkov. He didn't directly come from the modern art world where Curtis posits it. He came through a variety of pathways. He was for a time, he was a bodyguard for one of the oligarchs, Khodorkovsky, who you may remember standing in the dock in the previous series. He was the oil oligarch. And he worked as a TV executive. He worked in Khodorkovsky's bank, and eventually he rose to this position of, becoming an ideological advisor to Vladimir Putin. And he says, "I am the author, or one of the authors, of the new Russian system. My portfolio at the Kremlin and in government has included the ideology, media, political parties, religion, modernization, innovation, foreign relations, and modern art."
Now, is he still around, or
yes,
is he still working with?
He's not in a direct position anymore. I think he's continuing. I mean, part of what you discover about Surkov is, as we know, that he kind of works both sides, and he sees himself as what he says. This essay says his work, if indeed it is his, could be described as being satirical in nature, and quotes, aimed at the very government he is part of, a government which is perhaps his greatest project. With Surkov, nothing is clear, which is exactly the point. As one journalist puts it, for Surkov, there is no real freedom in the world except through the arts. So he continues. I think he has been part of setting up other parties. Putin's party is United Russia. And funnily enough, I mean, United Russia is an interesting thing. Surkov talks about United Russia, and he says, we consider it to be on the conservative end of the spectrum, and we're trying to strengthen this position. The left wing already has plenty of supporters. 3 of the 4 parties in the parliament are patriotic leftists. From that perspective, United Russia represents both liberal and conservative values. And basically, they're like the Russian version of Reform at this point.
Right. Yeah.
And that was then. But I think now he is out of the loop, Surkov. He's not directly working to the Kremlin, but then maybe he is.
Imagine if we just find out one day that Trump was a Surkov project.
Wouldn't be surprised.
Would you be that surprised?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know, that like Tucker Carlson's entire career has been like a Surkov art project or something.
Yeah, I mean, he this is what this particular essay is absolutely is fantastic on this stuff. There's a quote I'd like to read here again. Social media has engendered a commodification of the self by providing the individual with an aesthetic platform through which to construct an idealized persona. The process by which we do this, Boris Groys, he's a left-wing art theorist, is called self-design. And for Groys, this art theorist, self-design makes artworks and authors of us all, creating in the process a world of total design and with it, total suspicion. For self-design to succeed under these conditions, Groys, he goes on to suggest that it must neutralize suspicion by affirming it. As we no longer believe in the purity and sincerity of the modernist white cube, we seek the cracks to satisfy our cynicism. Only when we feel we have seen beneath the surface and glimpsed the ugly truth is our faith restored. I mean, that's very relevant to again the conspiracy frame. It's seeing the wickedness underneath that tells you must be right, you know. And he goes on to talk about Trump. In fact, he says,
but it's also a containment mechanism,
yes,
isn't it, for power? Yeah,
it's perfect. It's perfect. Yeah, it is in through expose and self-denunciation within celebrity culture that we see the most extreme and explicit manifestations of total suspicion, clearly illustrated by the rise of reality television and, quote, tell it like it is politicians, such as Donald Trump and Nigel Farage. Surkoff appears to understand this position perfectly and creates a unique brand of self-design by combining total disclosure with total design. This is what Curtis goes on to describe how he sets up these competing forces within society, within politics, and then he tells people he's doing it.
Mm-hmm. It really is fascinating. Do you think there's any sense in which Curtis's interest in this particular figure and his techniques is obliquely trying to tell us what our elites do, or do you think that Curtis is not aware of that level?
Yeah, he does go on to speculate on that in a little bit in this film. And it's obviously not conclusive. And again, when you look at the characters he brings up, and he brings up some footage of people like David Cameron, and you think, well, I mean, I just can't see Cameron having that much imagination, to be quite honest. But it could be a question of is there a Surkoff, in our system, that's setting up these contradistinctions that can be exploited by power.
I've got to the point, Simon, where I feel like the only legitimate job I could have is doing what this Surkoff guy does.
You're gonna
because I mean,
yeah.
Honestly, what else is there left to? The only actual thing that is not surrogate activity, is doing what he does.
Yes, exactly.
Actually, right, that project is the only actual thing left to do.
This is, I mean, and we're good. If we'll play a little bit more, but then I'll read you something else from this particular essay, which will blow your mind, actually, which will actually fit right in with what you're thinking there. There's another quote here. Domestically, this entails an acquiescence to a historically entrenched one-party system, while in the West, Surkoff becomes the Hollywood Russian, a Machiavellian anti-hero, and it's a role that he willfully embodies. So this is Curtis's. He's a hero of our age. But it's fraught with this ambiguity, and that is where the crux of power lies. It's not in this consistent offering; it's in this ability to manage this dialectic.
Mm-hmm. Surkoff is one of President Putin's advisors and has helped him maintain his power for 15 years. But he has done it in a very new way.
Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin.
He came originally from the avant-garde art world.
Just incredible. Look at that. Just look at the frame. Look at the mise en scène, Simon.
It's brilliant, isn't it? Is it? Yeah, I'd love to have doors like that in my living room.
Okay, but in Russia, that's not Andrew Lloyd Webber on a TV show. No. It's actually their leader.
Yeah, and obviously, I mean, this is, that has to be theatrically stage managed. Okay, President Putin, we'd like you to just stand there. Then we'll give you the cue. The doors will open. You will head down the red carpet, looking masterful. And everybody will think, wow.
Do you think it's even down to the level, Vlad? Remember, do the wide walk. Do the wide walk.
Yeah, but I mean, in a way, and Putin himself is kind of a brilliant actor in that sense, isn't he? He does that projection. I mean, you remember, the famous picture of Trump with the gloves on going down the red carpet.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same. It's the mirror. This is the mirror. I mean, actually, there's a funny little thing I like about this footage. Curtis, the background piece of music, which I posted earlier on Twitter, is a piece by Pie Corner Audio called "The Mirror Ball Cracked," and this idea of mirroring is kind of essential to understanding what Surkoff does.
Why do you think they made those doors so tall, Simon? They are
I don't know.
Ridiculous, aren't they?
And yet the guys at the bottom are like from Trumpton. Pew Pew, Barney McGrew, Cuthbert Dibble, and Putin.
What do they call in Russia? Vlad, Sven, Ben.
Igor.
Right, let's carry on.
And those who have studied his career say that what Surkov has done is import ideas from conceptual art into the very heart of politics. His aim is to undermine people's perception of the world, so they never know what is really happening. Surkov turned Russian politics into a bewildering, constantly changing piece of theatre. He sponsored all kinds of groups, from neo-Nazi skinheads to liberal human rights groups. He even backed parties that were opposed to President Putin.
Pause.
But
just a brief word to say on that, those parties that he sponsored. When they talk about neo-Nazi skinheads, they're not necessarily talking about the right wing there. The Nashi, as I understand, is one of these groups. I think that might have been some footage, the kids with the red shirts on and the red neckerchiefs. The Nashi is actually a nationalist Bolshevik group, the Nazbol, so to speak. So, they don't necessarily, portray their political struggles in the same way we do in the West. It's the nationalist left that is seen as kind of possibly thuggish, but it's also seen as very sort of, principled in its stances. It's anti-fascist, so that plays into the Russian sense of history in a kind of an advantageous way as well.
This Surkov chap looks a tiny little bit like one of my favorite men ever, Jose Mourinho. Just a little bit like Mourinho. So
he could be a young Mourinho, yeah.
Kind of like but instead of being a football manager, he's a manager of an entire political system.
Yeah.
A bit like a Russian James Burnham in a way. When you read that Pied Piper, Who Paid the Piper book. Similar kind of games, really. But let's carry on.
The key thing was that Surkov then let it be known that this was what he was doing, which meant that no one was sure what was real or fake. As one journalist put it, it's a strategy of power that keeps any opposition constantly confused, a ceaseless shape-shifting that is unstoppable because it's indefinable.
Sorry to pause it again. I am convinced that the West uses this strategy. And that people are, Twitter in and of itself, right, is like a madness engine where nothing actually fucking matters, right? The latest thing, whatever the storm in the teacup is this week, is forgotten by next week or the week after, and it's like it never happened. Right? I've even found myself, Simon, in scenarios where it's like, hold on, like 6 months ago, all of these different people were oriented in a different way. And now all of that's being forgotten. And now I'm playing a different role in that myself. This is why I left. It's literally an insanity engine. It's like a hyper version of what Curtis is talking about with Russia here, but just like to the nth degree. And nobody even knows what they're fighting for half the time.
This is the thing. We may not get to it at this moment. I was going to make some comments on his experimental film, It Felt Like a Kiss. And he gave some interesting interviews around that. But what he talked about this very problem of social media is that it's not Big Brother controlling what we do. It's the algorithm that is amplifying what we like. He talks about what he calls the great lump theory of the internet, is that it focuses down on what gets the most traction, and then we tend to model ourselves against that popularity. So that essentially it's the algorithm doing a work on us. We are trapped in this sort of oppositional mode, which doesn't actually require elites to do anything at all, simply because of this distributed digitalized sense of what he calls Google democracy. It's not real democracy. It's just this kind of stand-in which we have, which we think, as we'll see with All Washed Over by Machines of Loving Grace, we have this sense of distributed power, which is of course illusory, and people like Surkov are absolutely mastering this frame. And there's just this little image of Putin here, that he does this little shrug and he's got these dead eyes, and it's like saying, what are you going to do? What are you going to do about it?
Which is exactly what Surkov is alleged to have done in the Ukraine this year. In typical fashion, as the war began, Surkov published a short story about something he called nonlinear war. A war where you never know what the enemy are really up to, or even who they are. The underlying aim, Surkov says, is not to win the war, but to use the conflict to create a constant state of destabilised perception in order to manage and control. But maybe we have something similar emerging here in Britain. Everything we're told by journalists and politicians is confusing and contradictory. Of course, there is no Mr. Surkov in charge, but it's an odd, non-linear world that plays into the hands of those in power. British troops have come home from Afghanistan, but nobody seems to know whether it was a victory or whether it was a defeat. Aging disc jockeys are prosecuted for crimes they committed decades ago, while practically no one in the City of London is prosecuted for the endless financial crimes that are being revealed there. In Syria, we are told that President Assad is the evil enemy, but then his enemies turn out to be even more evil than him. So we bomb them, and by doing that, we help keep Assad in power. But the real epicenter of this non-linear world is the...
Well, so we didn't, and then back the evil overlord, which is what has happened now, right?
Yeah.
But they're not evil anymore. They've done a face turn, apparently.
Economy. And the closest we have to our own shape-shifting, postmodern politician is George Osborne. He tells us proudly that the economy is growing, but at the same time, wages are going down. He says he is cutting the deficit, but then it's revealed that the deficit is going up. But the dark heart of this shape-shifting world is quantitative easing. The government is insisting on taking billions of pounds out of the economy through its austerity programme. Yet at the very same time, it is pumping billions of pounds into the economy through quantitative easing.
Well, actually, Adam Curtis, the quantitative easing never hits the M0 money supply. It remains in the M2 and the M3, so it never sees the real economy.
Yeah.
So sorry, Simon.
No. You. I mean, I was just going to say, yeah. So it's that that contradiction. No money for Granny, plenty of money for Ukraine.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
The equivalent of £24,000 for every family in Britain. But it gets even more confusing, because the Bank of England have admitted that those billions of pounds have not gone where they are supposed to. A vast amount of the money has actually found its way into the hands of the wealthiest 5% in Britain. It has been described as the biggest transfer of wealth to the rich in recent documented history.
Until COVID.
Yeah.
And Ukraine, which were even bigger wealth transfers.
Yeah, I mean, this is 11 years ago now. This film. Think on that.
It could be a huge scandal, comparable to the greedy oligarchs in Russia. A ruthless elite siphoning off billions of public money.
Pause. And in respect to that siphoning off public money, oligarchs, Dale Vince, who runs Ecotricity, that builds all those windmills, has had £100 million of government money. Oh, sorry, that's your money. Subsidies.
But who cares about all that, Simon? Let's own the libs.
Yay!
But nobody seems to know. It sums up the strange mood of our time, where nothing really makes any coherent sense. We live with a constant vaudeville of contradictory stories that makes it impossible for any real opposition to emerge, because they can't counter it with a coherent narrative of their own. And it means that we as individuals become ever more powerless, unable to challenge anything, because we live in a state of confusion and uncertainty.
See, I would love to have seen Curtis update this, because what he's kind of glided over, in my opinion, is that many of the journalists, many of this class of people who he's focusing on here, at some point just gave up and joined the ruling class. Like, they just started just becoming quiet cheerleaders of the status quo and of power, basically. From I would argue from Obama onwards, basically, or from, even in this country, from Blair onwards, really.
Well, possibly even slightly earlier. In one of the interviews, he talks about, essentially, there was a class who wasn't getting access to power, and Mrs. Thatcher liberated them, and that is why, Tony Blair was her spiritual heir. because in defiance of the established stuffy elites, it needed this new sort of meritocratic striver to come into power, irrespective of what ideology they carried, in order to have that circulation, and essentially she opened the floodgates for that.
Yeah. You know what I'm saying, right? The journalists just became Pravda for the system, basically.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
They don't do any, like they don't really do any of the expose stuff anymore. At least not what I've seen. I don't see any, like the BBC is just. I think they've gone into themselves, into this cozy thing that you were talking about. It's all kind of like, got this strange tone of not really talking about anything at all.
It's Mariana Spring telling us that we're to blame in the BBC.
Yeah, Mariana Spring. Yeah,
lantern jawed highlighter girl. It's the Zaku's is coming at us. It's not going towards some corporation for polluting the water supply somewhere. That's what Robert F. Kennedy tells you these days. He's the guy who does that sort of stuff. The kind of the outsider political insurgent, whereas the journalist is concentrated on refining, reframing, and sanitizing stories in order to say, no, it's not to do with all of these people coming over the channel in boats. It's to do with your hatred of them. That there is the reason your country's rubbish.
The moment Mariana Spring is fired will be the moment that
fired.
We've truly won. Where she is no longer. I surely can't be the only one who thinks that she is a, regardless of her politics, she's a bit of a wood as well.
Life is full of these terrible conflicted moments.
I mean, for a BBC journalist, she's not bad. I thought Mariana Spring. I'd give her a bit of disinformation, wouldn't you? Anyway,
no comment.
All right.
So I just want to end cap this stuff off about Surkoff. This is the bit that I found really interesting in this essay. I'll just read these 2 paragraphs. So he talks about, that they talked about that art theorist Groys talking about social media and self-design. This is what Surkoff has mastered, this world of self-design. You design your persona, your prominence, your political authority and power, and you also invest it with this total suspicion. So it's a combination of total design and total suspicion. So as Curtis frames it here, nobody knows quite what's going on. And he refers it to this celebrity culture where, people like Donald Trump can say outrageous things which appear to undermine him, and yet at the same time he becomes massively more popular. Yeah. So the essay goes on, and it has these last couple of paragraphs. And when I read this, I thought this is so serendipitous to find this in an essay about Vlad Surkoff. But this is what the writer says. He says, a peculiar example of this postmodern rhetoric exists in the comedy of Stuart Lee. His television stand-up series, Stuart Lee's Comedy Vehicle, is punctuated by a series of confessional interview sketches in which he half-heartedly defends the process by which he performs. Here, the interviewer, Chris Morris, assumes the role of the critic, while Lee struggles to justify himself, seemingly confirming the audience's fear that his performance may be fraudulent. This calculated self-denunciation is then inverted within the main body of the show, where he vigorously defends his style by revealing a deep understanding of his audience's implicit suspicions. Here,
sorry, Simon, just for my understanding, this is Surkoff on Stuart Lee.
This is an essay about Surkoff that just comes up with this example of Surkoff's techniques.
I see.
Being applied by Stuart Lee.
Who is the author?
It's a chap called James Dixon, and I'll post up a link after this.
Okay, yeah, it'd be fascinating. Carry on.
He talks about he talks about this calculated self-denunciation is then inverted within the main body of the show, where he vigorously defends his style by revealing a deep understanding of his audience's implicit suspicions. Here, domination of the critical landscape is used to comic effect, with the spectator finding humor through submission. However, the technical parallels are striking. Lee ends Series 4 of his Comedy Vehicle with a stark performance of a depressed and suicidal comic at the mercy of his audience, at times so convincing that the audience begins to doubt whether they are witnessing an act. For Boris Groys, this left-wing art theorist, this total submission is an example of a subtler and more sophisticated form of self-design symbolic suicide. By implicating the audience in his apparent breakdown, Lee removes the final critical position, detachment. In this scenario, the spectator becomes a participant in the work. In the words of Boris Groys, when the viewer is involved in artistic practice from the outset, every piece of criticism uttered becomes self-criticism. By relinquishing authorship through collaboration, suspicion is nullified. And interestingly, this is achieved through a reversal of postmodern atomization. So I thought that was an interesting example of the framing of the public self as this flawed person as well as this masterful person. And Surkoff, in a sense, permits the elite to adopt that frame in order to both, cultivate and curry support and favor, and to keep opponents off balance at the same time.
So, I mean, does Putin ever kind of do the Stuart Lee thing of just kind of admitting his mistakes, whatever?
Yeah, I wonder. It would be interesting to see analysis of how that relates. I mean, Putin obviously exists in our mind, like Curtis was saying earlier, as the Hollywood villain. And he is kind of behind those massive gold doors. We kind of don't know. And in a sense, maybe he fulfills an ultimate Machiavellian position of, the ultimate power, but one in which his bad, evil works, let's say, are deployed through other people. And he himself represents, the man behind the golden door, the ultimate authority. That then perhaps this serves him in a way that, Surkoff can manage the performance and Putin just has to come on and say the lines.
Yeah, it's very difficult for some of us to get away from this. I mean, even I, whenever I've made videos, Simon, where I have to have multiple different, when I record it at different times, let's say there's a camera involved, right? I always then develop the present AA and past AA, who then start critiquing each other.
Yeah.
Right? I find it impossible to get away from.
Yeah.
But there's a built-in defense mechanism because it kind of puts you beyond. It puts you beyond. Like you've already made the critique yourself, right?
Yeah.
I'll give you a good example of this, right? Which is that there's this very odd chap on Twitter at the moment who's, I don't know, trying to get my attention or whatever, who keeps on posting pictures of me with quotes, right? And then every once in a while he'll put in a quote of Stephen Fry, right?
Okay.
Because he's trying to claim that. I don't know, I guess the gist of his analysis is something like, oh, well, this guy is a bit of a kind of an artsy fartsy suit or something like this.
Okay.
Just like Stephen Fry in this thing. One of the things that I was interested to discover was that this exact critique had been made a year previously by none other than me. In this, academic agent explains the thinking behind his new hit series, Talking Turley. And
Wow.
it's the clip, it's the exact clip of Stephen Fry talking about levels, right? So the self-awareness already punctured the attempt at ridicule because I'm already self-aware. So his attempt can't land because I've already said, yeah, that's true. Stuart Lee.
Am I talking to the real academic agent?
But you see, this is the thing.
Yeah,
that kind of works on this very small level. But what Surkoff has done basically is scale that up to the level of the entire Russian state.
Yeah. I'll also post an interview with him in the Spiegel, the German newspaper, which is fascinating when you read it because I mean he is slipperier than a greased otter in a vat of olive oil. I mean, he is a really interesting character. It's kind of like he can acknowledge he's lying and think nothing of it. And so what? And it keeps you guessing at every stage.
Very interesting stuff, and it sets us up nicely for the next one, which is that the what is the next one?
The next
Curtis.
The next Curtis is all watched over by Machines of Loving Grace, which is a 3-part series on. It starts with looking at Ayn Rand and the Asian debt crisis, which is an interesting conjunction, you might think, but one that plays out interestingly in the light of the recent, Musk meltdown at Christmas and all of that stuff.
Dissident Knight has come in with a super chat saying, appetizers, where can I support Mr. Roberts? Mr. Roberts, where can Dissident Knight support you?
I don't know. I'll DM you my address. I think diamonds are always in good taste.
Retronus says, good evening to the both of you. I hope your day has been well. I showed up late today, so I'll rewatch the stream later. I love the Curtis streams, he says. And I think that's it. They're never big earners, these Curtis streams, but in a way, it's for the love of the art, Simon.
It's pro bono work.
Indeed.
Yeah.
All right. Well, hopefully we'll be back next week. Hopefully my Shakespeare course will be finished by then. I'm going to have to spend most of the rest of the day and all night probably doing that. But yes, nice to have a diversion from thinking about the Bard. And I'll see you next week, Simon.
You'll see me then. Have a good evening.
What goes on in this town is none of your business.
As long as I'm living here, it is.
Then maybe you shouldn't be living here!
Well, that's easily fixed.